Separated as we are by the safety and comfortable distance of almost 200 years from the events of the Texas Revolution, it's easy to fall into the complacent viewing of them as part of the grand and romantic narrative of Texas history that started being shaped when it first became a possibility that there might be such a history as the sun set on April 21st, 1836. We have been conditioned to rely on words like glory, glorious, bravery, heroism, villainy, tyranny, destiny, and more such descriptive words when we remember it each year. And that's all well and good. But it's also good to remember that these were real people facing real challenges with a variety of motivations and opinions, both personal and collective. They were not just characters in a story playing a role. They were alive and had dreams and aspirations. They each had a future until many of them did not. And many futures were terminated in 1835 and 1836 with the impact of a musket ball or the collision of a bayonet with a body. It's been said, and I believe it's fairly true, that we are a nation shaped by war. And the Texas Revolution was but one part of our long warlike history. But its battles and its resulting aftermath loom large in the overall narrative. There is not a doubt that the dead had wanted to be longer involved in that narrative's construction, but that is the nature of life and the nature of war. As one writer said, so it goes. War is hell. So goes the oft-repeated statement attributed to General William Tecumseh Sherman. He was 16 years old when the events of April 21st, 1836 unfolded on a strip of land where the San Jacinto River and Buffalo Bayou meet. His entrance into the life of war would come after his graduation from West Point in 1840 and his service in the Second Seminole War and the United States Civil War. And if I may be permitted to digress at the beginning, in Cormac McCarthy's brutal classic Blood Meridian, the character Judge Holden expounds on his thoughts on war and its centrality to human existence. And I wanted to share some excerpts that I've edited down from a passage in the book. And let's begin with this. It makes no difference what men think of war, said the judge. War endures. As well ask men what they think of stone. War was always here. Before man was, war waited for him. The ultimate trade awaiting its ultimate practitioner. That is the way it was and will be. That way and not some other way. And a few lines later, the judge adds, all other trades are contained in that of war. And then another character asks, is that why war endures? And Judge Holden replies, no. It endures because young men love it and old men love it in them. Those that fought, those that did not. And the other man responds, that's your notion. And then McCarthy writes, the judge smiled. Men are born for games, nothing else. Every child knows that play is nobler than work. He knows, too, that the worth or merit of a game is not inherent in the game itself, but rather in the value of that which is put at hazard. Games of chance require a wager to have meaning at all. Games of sport involve the skill and strength of the opponents, and the humiliation of defeat and the pride of victory are in themselves sufficient stake because they inhere in the worth of the principles and define them. But trial of chance or trial of worth, all games aspire to the condition of war. For here, that which is wagered swallows up game, player all. Suppose two men at cards with nothing to wager save their lives. Who has not heard such a tale? A turn of the card. The whole universe for such a player has labored clanking to this moment, which will tell if he is to die at that man's hand or that man at his. What more certain validation of a man's worth could there be? This enhancement of the game to its ultimate state admits no argument concerning the notion of fate. The selection of one man over another is preference absolute and irrevocable, and it is a dull man indeed who could reckon so profound a decision without agency or significance either one. In such games as have for their stake the annihilation of the defeated, the decisions are quite clear. This man holding this particular arrangement of cards in his hand is thereby removed from existence. This is the nature of war, whose stake is at once the game and the authority and the justification. Seen so, war is the truest form of divination. It is the testing of one's will and the will of another within that larger will, which, because it binds them, is therefore forced to select. War is the ultimate gain because war is at last a forcing of the unity of existence. War is God. And that's the end of the judge's statements there that I wanted to share. Now, Ernest Hemingway, who did his fair share of witnessing war, said, "Never think that war, no matter how necessary nor how justified, is not a crime. Ask the infantry and ask the dead." And he also said, "No catalog of horrors ever kept men from war." William Faulkner adds, "Because no battle is ever won," he said, "they are not even fought. The field only reveals to man his own folly and despair, and victory is an illusion of philosophers and fools." The Son of Man, as Jesus is sometimes called in the Gospels, also made comments on war. "And when ye shall hear of wars and rumors of wars, be ye not troubled, for such things must needs be, but the end shall not be yet." And he also said, "All they that take the sword shall perish with the sword." How to think about these quotes is open to debate. But one thing that is not up for debate is that in 1836, the Texian revolutionaries and the volunteers that had flooded their army were in the game of their lives with the army of General Santa Anna. And at stake, to again quote William Barret Travis, was victory or death. Or as Shakespeare wrote in Henry VI, Part 3, "Sound trumpets, let our bloody colors wave, and either victory or else a grave." But that is not completely accurate. In the end, when all the moves in the game were made, the game of war would end with both victory and death. Mucha muerte. It's well known that Sam Houston had a lifelong love for Homer's Iliad, so it might do well to borrow from the ancient poet's works. There would be killing till the score was paid. Death and the strong force of fate were waiting. Slaughter and blood and the agonized groans of mangled men had been the price paid to the god of war in the battles and slaughters of the Texas War, and these offerings would again be submitted when the armies of Sam Houston and Santa Anna finally met in battle, and each general made their moves in the game. When Santa Anna had departed from Bear on March 31st, he left behind Sanchez Navarro. And Sanchez Navarro, he had wanted to participate in the ongoing campaign as a member of Cosa's staff, but was left behind. And he wrote, "It was denied me because he," meaning Santa Anna, "says that the campaign is already finished. I cannot persuade myself that this is true." And Sanchez Navarro also wrote, "I believe that His Excellency has no idea of the great rivers, deep arroyos, lakes, and dense forests through which he will have to travel. I pray for God to look with favor upon His Excellency and all those who accompany him. However, I very much fear the realization of the old adage, he who triumphs by luck alone without making plans for battle loses everything when he meets defeat." Had Santa Anna been open to advice from such men, the campaign in Texas might have turned out quite differently. The Texian army, moving east, and Mexican forces searching for them, did so slowly. Suffering was their new normal. Hunger and cold and the mud were their companions. They were both contending with the same miserable conditions facing the thousands of Texans running away to the east. It was a cold and wet spring, and the frequent rains had pushed the rivers and creeks out of banks. Santa Anna moved onward, leaving Filasola behind with some troops for the arduous task of moving the artillery and supplies across the river. Santa Anna and Sesma reached San Felipe on April 7th to find it as Mosley Baker had left it, burned. Baker had also destroyed the ferry, leaving rafts the only options for crossing. And rafts were not an option because using them would make the Mexican soldiers easy targets for Baker's men to shoot from the opposite bank of the river. Santa Anna started for Fort Bend on the Brazos near modern-day Richmond, Texas, and sent orders to Filasola, Urea, and Gaona to join him there. Once they were reunited, Santa Anna would have 3,400 men at his command to deal with Houston and his smaller band of soldiers. But this is not what happened. While at Fort Bend, Santa Anna learned that the ad interim government of Texas was only 30 miles away at Harrisburg on the right bank of Buffalo Bayou. Harrisburg was located just southeast of present-day downtown Houston. How could Santa Anna resist such an opportunity? First, he thought he would capture and punish the so-called government of Texas, and then move to crush the cowardly Houston and the fleeing Texans. That Santa Anna had little respect for the fleeing colonists and Houston's army is apparent in his 1837 manifesto, in which he wrote, "In spite of these impostures, there remained with Houston out of 1,500 men only the 800 with which he surprised my camp at San Jacinto. It could not be otherwise, a very considerable number having perished at Bayard, the Alamo, Goliad, and the plain of Perdido. In short, this was shown by the proclamations of the so-called government of Texas, in all of which appeals were made in desperate terms for the sympathy of the Americans to come to the rescue of their defeated hosts. Since the colonists, either voluntarily or forced by circumstances, persisted in taking refuge beyond the scene of war, Santa Anna felt completely justified in all of his actions. Since the Texians were relying mostly on an army filled with men from the United States. News from Fort Bend of Santa Anna's plans reached Houston on April 12, and he took advantage of the presence of the steamboat Yellowstone and used it to move his command across the Brazos. Across the Brazos, and with the Twin Sisters cannons in tow, Houston and the Army of Texas moved on. But were they going to fight or just keep moving? That was a question that people in the government and soldiers themselves kept asking. But Houston kept counsel only with himself. Santa Anna decided to press on with a smaller contingent of soldiers. In orders for Urea, he said, "I leave today for Harrisburg with 500 men and 1 of artillery. I will arrive there day after tomorrow and hope to find the principal leaders of the revolution at that place, employing my ability to effortlessly defeat the so-called General Sam Houston, who is supposed to be on the march to that place with about 600 or 800 men. He is the only hope left for the traitors." And the number of soldiers traveling with Santa Anna is often listed at 700 to 750. The cause for this discrepancy between 500 and 750 might be explained by looking at a statement by George Erath, an Austrian who fought with Texas. With an actual force of hardly 600 men, he wrote, Santa Anna left his army. In all, he had perhaps 1,000 with him, but the rest were only cargadores or muleteers with some 400 or 500 pack mules to be loaded. An officer that was with Santa Anna, Colonel Pedro Delgado, wrote, "On the 14th of April, 1836, His Excellency, the President, ordered his staff to prepare to march with only 1 skiff, and leaving his own and the officer's baggage with General Ramirez y Sesma, who was instructed to remain at the crossing of the Brazos, whither we expected to return in 3 days. On the 13th, the flank companies of the battalions of Matamoros, Aldama, Guerrero, Toluca, Mexico, and I believe Guadalajara had commenced crossing the river with a 6-pounder commanded by Lieutenant Ignacio Arenal and 50 mounted men of Tampico and Guanajuato, who formed His Excellency's escort. The whole force amounted to 600 men, more or less. About 4:00 p.m., His Excellency started for Harrisburg with the force above mentioned. The bottom of the Brazos is dense and lofty timber over 3 leagues wide. On reaching the prairie, we found a small creek which offered only one crossing. The infantry passed it comfortably over a large tree which had fallen in such a manner as to form a convenient bridge. The ammunition was passed over by hand, but His Excellency, to avoid delay, ordered the baggage and the commissary stores to remain packed on the mules. However, the water was soon over the pack saddles, and the opposite bank was steep and slippery. Several mules fell down, interfering with each other, which resulted in a terrible jamming of officers and dragoons, horses and mules. This, together with shouts and curses, completed a scene of wild confusion, which His Excellency witnessed with hearty laughter. Several officers and dragoons fell into the water, the stores were damaged, and 2 mules were drowned. So much for the precipitation of this march. The sun had already set when we resumed the march over a muddy prairie. The night was dark, a great many men straggled off, and our piece of artillery bogged at every turn of the wheel. Such was our condition when at about 9 o'clock His Excellency ordered a halt in a small grove, where we passed the night without water. Despite these troubles, Santa Anna reached Harrisburg on April 15th. He was disappointed to learn that he had just missed catching the Texas government. Barnet and the others had moved on towards Galveston Bay. Santa Anna had the town burned, and the only residence left standing was that of John W. Moore, who was a signer of the Texas Declaration of Independence. That little bit of trivia must have escaped Santa Anna's knowledge, or Moore and his house were just pretty lucky. The government of Texas just kept ahead of Santa Anna by traveling to New Washington at Morgan's Point on the coast. This is near the modern site of La Porte. Colonel Delgado provides a first-hand account of these events. He wrote, "On the 15th at 8 a.m., most of the stragglers joined. We started again. At about noon, we reached a plantation abundantly supplied with corn, sheep, and hogs. It had a good garden and fine cotton gin. We halted to refresh men and beasts. At 3:00 p.m., after having set fire to the dwelling and gin house, we resumed our march. Here His Excellency started ahead with his staff and escort, leaving General Castrillon in command of the infantry. We traveled at a brisk trot for at least 10 leagues without halting, until we reached the vicinity of Harrisburg about 11 o'clock at night. His Excellency, with an adjutant and 15 dragoons, went afoot to that town, distant about 1 mile, entered it, and succeeded in capturing 2 Americans who stated that Zavala and other members of the so-called government of Texas had left the morning before for Galveston. A part of the infantry joined us on the following morning at daylight. On the 16th, we remained at Harrisburg to await the arrival of our broken-down stragglers, who kept dropping in until 2 or 3 p.m. On the opposite side of the bayou, we found 2 or 3 houses well supplied with wearing apparel, mainly for women's use, fine furniture, an excellent piano, jars of preserves, chocolate, fruit, etc., all of which was appropriated for the use of His Excellency and his attendants. I and others obtained only what they could not use. After the houses had been sacked and burned down, a party of Americans fired upon our men from the woods. It is wonderful that some of us, camped as we were along the bank of the bayou, were not killed. The quartermaster sergeant of Matamoros was seriously wounded. This incident took place at 5:00 p.m. On the same day, Colonel Almonte started from Harrisburg for New Washington with the cavalry. And this Colonel Almonte, traveling with 50 dragoons ahead of Santa Anna towards New Washington, sent a report to Santa Anna that colonists had told him that Houston was headed for the Trinity River, and would have to cross the San Jacinto at Lynchburg. Santa Anna sent an order to Filasola to send Coast with 500 choice soldiers to the San Jacinto instead of going to Velasco where they were originally intended. On April 16th, while Santa Anna was in Harrisburg, Houston and the Army reached Spring Creek in present-day Harris County. The next day, they would reach a spot where the road diverged and presented two options. One option led towards Louisiana, the other led towards Harrisburg and the Mexican Army. The men wondered what was going on in the mind of their commander. Many of them threatened to rebel if Houston pointed them towards Louisiana. Of course, this distrustful and fractious bunch included Mr. Mosley Baker. Even though angered by the constant attacks on his authority, Houston might have appreciated the honesty of his subordinate yet vocal opponents. As it reads in the Iliad, Achilles says, "Hateful to me as the gates of Hades is that man who hides one thing in his heart and speaks another." Houston didn't have to worry about that with most of his men. They were pretty honest with him. On April 17th, the Texian army took the fork towards Harrisburg. Also on April 17th, Santa Anna decided to go in pursuit of the fleeing Texas government. The route led them by the property of the Vince brothers, Allen, William, Robert, and Richard, members of Stephen F. Austin's Old 300, whose name became attached to the bayou and the bridge that crossed it. As they traveled by, they confiscated Allen Vince's black stallion for Santa Anna. Delgado wrote, on the 17th at about 3 p.m., His Excellency, after instructing me to burn the town, started for New Washington with the troops. It was nearly dark when we finished crossing the bayou. Then a courier from Colonel Almonte arrived, upon which His Excellency ordered Colonel Iberri to start with his adjutant bearing dispatches to General Filasola on the Brazos. At 7:00 p.m., we resumed our march. Our piece of artillery bogged at every moment in some hole or ravine. As it was found impossible for the draft mules to cross a narrow bridge, rendered still more dangerous by darkness and rain, His Excellency instructed General Castrillon to head the bayou with the cannon 3 leagues above, with an escort of only 1 company of infantry. Shortly after 10 o'clock at night, a violent storm set in. Darkness caused us to wander from our course, in consequence of which His Excellency caused a halt, requiring every man to stand in the ranks without shelter from the rain. On the morning of the 18th, we moved on, our cannon still being far away. At noon, we reached New Washington, where we found flour, soap, tobacco, and other articles, which were issued to the men. His Excellency instructed me to mount one of his horses and with a small party of dragoons to gather beeves for the use of the troops. In a short time, I drove in over 100 head of cattle, so abundant are they in that country. General Castrillon came in at 5:00 p.m. with the cannon. Now, Manuel Fernandez Castrillon, who is the General Castrillon in care of the cannon, was of Spanish descent, and he was at this time in his mid-50s, and he had fought alongside Santa Anna since 1821. And he's also the same Castrillon who had argued for the mercy for men at the Alamo and Goliad, but he was overruled. On the 18th, Houston and the Texas rebels arrived near White Oak Bayou, a tributary of Buffalo Bayou, and camped near the burned ruins of Harrisburg. And that same day, Deaf Smith arrived at camp, and he brought with him a captured Mexican courier who had dispatches that revealed more about Santa Anna's plans and the movements of the Mexican army. Houston knew that the main part of the Mexican army was being strengthened at Fort Bend. While he believed that there were about 1,000 soldiers there at the time, in fact, it was much worse. Filasola was gathering a force of 4,000. Houston also thought that Gaona was west of the Brazos River. Santa Anna had crossed over the bridge at Vince's Bayou and traveled down the west side of the bayou and the San Jacinto River. He would be returning to the area of Lynch's Ferry. They would need the ferry or the bridge to cross back over. Houston analyzed the dispatches and said to Thomas Rusk, "We need not talk. You think we ought to fight, and I think so too. So based on information that each leader had received, Santa Anna and Houston made decisions to head towards that same area. Now, at this time, Rusk and Houston again both issued appeals to the people of Texas. Secretary of War Rusk, who had joined the Army, began his appeal by writing, "Fellow citizens, let me make one more appeal to you to rally to the standard of your country." And then a little bit more into it, he added, "A few more hours will decide the fate of our army. And what an astonishing fact it is that at the very moment when the fate of your wives and children, your homes, your country, and all that is dear to a free man are suspended upon the issue of one battle, not 1/4 of the people of Texas are with the army." And in that, when he said people, he's meaning not 1/4 of the available men that could fight in Texas were not with the Texas Army. And Houston added his own statement, which included the line, "We view ourselves on the eve of battle. We are nerved for the contest and must conquer or perish." Houston also penciled a letter, which he gave to Rusk, and he had a copy given to Hockley, who was on his staff, and he had another copy sent to Henry Raggett up in Nacogdoches. And he did this to help ensure that the record of his thoughts were preserved in case things went wrong. He wrote, "This morning we are in preparation to meet Santa Anna. It is the only chance of saving Texas. From time to time I have looked for reinforcements in vain. The convention's adjournment to Harrisburg struck panic throughout the country. Texas could have started at 4,000 men. We will only be about 700 to march, besides the camp guard, but we will go to conquest." And he added that the troops were in fine spirits and that this was the time for action. Even if they would be outnumbered, which Houston expected, he was leaving the, quote, "result in the hands of an all-wise God." And so on the morning of April 19th, Houston announced to the Texian soldiers that it looked like they would soon get the action that they had been waiting for so long. And to fuel their fire, he stressed that they must remember the Alamo and Goliad. Still, rumors spread among the soldiers that Houston had no intention of fighting. The main instigators of these rumors included, of course, Mosley Baker. Again, Baker and others would be irritants to Houston for the rest of his life. Late on April 19th, Houston moved his army to the south or west, depending on how you read the map, side of Buffalo Bayou on rafts, about 2.5 miles below Harrisburg. He left behind a small detachment to guard the sick men and the baggage in the woods. The number left behind, mostly sick or ineffective, was about 248. When he had asked for volunteers to serve as the guard for the sick and the baggage, not a man volunteered. All wanted to be a part of the upcoming battle. Houston had wanted to leave the valiant Tejanos that were serving with 29-year-old Juan Seguin to serve as guards for the sick and the supplies. But Seguin would have nothing of it. You got to remember, Seguin had been at the Alamo and was only alive because he had been entrusted to carry a message from that doomed place. Had he not been sent as a courier, bearing yet another message crying for reinforcements, he more than likely would have shared the fate of the 7 Tejanos that had originally followed him into the mission. But no, Seguin and the Tejanos wanted to fight. Sergeant Antonio Menchaca told Houston, "I did not enlist to guard horses and would not do such duty." They wanted to exact their share of vengeance for the fallen. Houston acquiesced to Seguin's argument, and they were assigned as members of the newly arrived Colonel Sidney Sherman's regiment of Kentucky Riflemen, with one stipulation. Houston was very aware of the Anglo-Americans' ill will towards the Mexican people, and for the Tejano soldiers' safety, they were asked to place pieces of cardboard in the bands of their hats to signify them as allies. And with that settled, Seguin and the Tejano rebels departed Harrisburg with the rest of the Texian army. Just before sundown on April 19th, Houston addressed the men to ready their spirits for the fight. And he closed by saying, "This is our battle cry. Remember the Alamo. Remember Goliad." The men repeated the words. Houston cried it out again, and again the men roared. Houston later wrote, "This watchword was caught up by every man in the army, and one simultaneous shout broke up into the sky, and the green islands of the trees and the prairie sent back the echo." After speaking to the men on the night of April 19th and telling them that it was imperative that they remember the Alamo and remember Goliad as they prepared for battle, even though many still didn't believe they were going to fight. That night, Houston and about 750 to 900 men, depending on who you can believe when it comes to numbers, because sources vary in how they are added up, Houston and the Texian army crossed the wooden bridge over Vince's Bayou. And they were traveling light, and they marched until about midnight. They stopped for a brief rest, and then they continued on at dawn. Houston did not sleep that night. Before sunrise, he sent out 2 cavalry detachments to do some reconnaissance. One group went towards Nathaniel Lynch's ferry, the only practicable crossing to travel towards the Trinity and Sabine rivers, and the other group rode towards New Washington, where Santa Anna had been in pursuit of the interim Texas government that was fleeing. And as they neared Lynch's ferry, the Texians captured a flatboat filled with supplies for the Mexican army, and Santa Anna had sent it on ahead from New Washington to be there to supply the army when he got there. But as it turns out, the hungry Texians benefited from it, and Houston and the rest of the army arrived about mid-morning. While the main body had been taking the ferry and started eating breakfast, the other detachment of mounted scouts that had been at New Washington had also been busy. While they were down at New Washington, they had witnessed Santa Anna's force readying to leave the town. There was a brief skirmish with a small troop of Mexican cavalry north of New Washington, and then they rushed to report to Houston. Santa Anna would be approaching the ferry on the road from Morgan's Point in New Washington. So when the scouts arrived with their news, the Texians were eating breakfast. And the news excited many of the men who were ready for conflict. Now, these men carried a vast array of weaponry. The regulars, few that they were the only ones armed in a somewhat consistent manner. Most of the regulars carried the Model 1816 Harper's Ferry smoothbore flintlock musket along with bayonets, which were a necessity in close combat after the single round had been fired. And the volunteers, they didn't have bayonets, but most carried a knife of some sort, including ones modeled after the famous one carried by Jim Bowie. These knives would have done the job of the bayonet in hand-to-hand combat. Their rifles were likewise varied, and some, especially the cavalry, would have had flintlock pistols and sabers. These men were also a varied lot. They came from all across the United States and places in Europe. To clear their weapons of moisture, several hundred men fired. This upset Houston. He chastised them, told them to be silent. Why alert the enemy of their location if they were close? He threatened to skewer the next man to fire his gun on his sword, but the irascible soldiers did not listen to his profane threats. Fortunately, the Mexican army did not hear the noise. They were too far away still. Eventually, in the distance, the Texians could see smoke in the direction of New Washington. While at Harrisburg, Santa Anna had sent Colonel Juan N. Almonte ahead, if you recall, with 50 dragoons to catch the fleeing Texas government. Santa Anna had followed with the rest of his force. Almonte narrowly missed capturing Burnet and much of his cabinet. President Burnet, along with his wife and the other officials, had just embarked in a rowboat. Almonte's men started firing at them, but seeing the presence of a woman on board, the colonel ordered them to cease fire. The Texas government eventually reached safety on Galveston Island, and Santa Anna arrived on April 19th to find that his desire to capture the so-called government of Texas had been thwarted again. The Texian army, after getting the news from the cavalry, then traveled back about 3/4 of a mile from the ferry on the Harrisburg Road. Houston ordered the men to set up camp along the bayou in a wooded area protected from view by a piece of rising ground. The camp was spread out for about 500 yards through the trees. The 2nd Regiment of Volunteers set up closest to the 200 to 300 yard wide bayou. Southwest of them camped Lieutenant Colonel Henry Millard's regiment of regulars. Southwest of them were the cavalry, and east of the cavalry was Colonel Edward Burleson's 1st Regiment of Volunteers. East of Millard's regulars is where J.C. Neal placed the 2 cannons, and they still had not yet been fired since their arrival. And there were not many tents. Most of the men had been sleeping and would sleep that night on the cold, damp ground near the 20 to 30 campfires that they had to set up. The only definitely known tent that was set up belonged to the commander, Sam Houston, and the bayou was at their rear. The San Jacinto was to their left, and on their front and right flank was the open prairie. Now, this land on which the Texian army found itself had been the land of the Iroquois, Ishak, the Atakosas, and the Karankawas possibly would have even come there also to hunt and live. But at this time, when they encamped in the Live Oak Grove near Lynch's Ferry, the land belonged to a woman by the name of Peggy McCormick. Now, like about 100 of the Texian soldiers in the army at that time, 1/7 of the entire army, she was born in Ireland. The Irish had been early settlers of Texas, and at the Alamo, 12 of the defenders were Irish born, and another 14 had Irish surnames. Mrs. McCormick, who was close to 50 years old, and her husband Arthur had both been born in Ireland in the late 1700s. In 1818, they immigrated to New Orleans, and then around 1823, Mr. and Mrs. McCormick, along with their 2 sons, John and Michael, had arrived in Stephen Austin's colony as part of the Old 300. They were deeded a league of land on the south side of Buffalo Bayou at its junction with the San Jacinto River on August 10th, 1824. Now, Arthur's stay in Texas was unfortunately not a long one. Arthur McCormick visited Stephen Austin at San Felipe in February and received approval to establish an iron colony. The dream came to nothing, though, because Arthur drowned in Buffalo Bayou on his return home. But Peggy McCormick and her 2 sons stayed on and persevered to build a life in Mexican Texas. They built a log cabin close to a small bay on the San Jacinto River known as Peggy's Lake, and they raised cattle on the prairie to drive and sell in Louisiana. When word of the disasters at the Alamo and Goliad had reached them, Mrs. McCormick joined the runaway scrape. Michael McCormick served as a courier for the government, and it would be this Irish woman's north cow pasture on which the decisive moment for the contest between the Texian and Mexican armies would play out. Alfonso Steele, who was originally from Kentucky and who lived to be the last survivor of the Texas army that fought at San Jacinto, left an interesting summary of the events of that day. He wrote, "We quit Santa Anna's trail when we crossed Vince's Bayou, we turning north, he east. About sunup, we were halted to get something to eat. About the time we got our fires kindled and some beef shot down, the scouts came dashing in and said the enemy were just over the ridge. We were immediately ordered to arms and to move on. We camped on Buffalo Bayou just above the junction of the San Jacinto River and the bayou. Some more beeves were driven up and killed, and we went to cooking and eating." He continued by saying, "There was a body of Mexicans in a little grove about 300 yards northeast of us who kept up a constant fire on us all the time we were cooking and eating, but they did no damage. 2 of our men slipped out through the grass to see if they could get close enough to shoot them. They discovered a little sailboat sailing up the bayou. They hid in the grass and waited until it got even with them. They then rose up and ordered them ashore. They saw it was manned by Mexicans, who jumped out on the opposite side and swam ashore and left the boat. One of the men gave his gun to his comrade and swam in and steered it right up to our camp. It was loaded with flour, meal, and salt. Houston placed a guard over it and sent the surgeons to see if it had been poisoned. They pronounced it all right, so it was issued out to us. This was the first bread we had had in some time. We had left our cooking utensils at Harrisburg, so we had nothing to cook bread on. We made it up in tin cups and roasted it in the ashes or rolled it on sticks and cooked it that way. We feasted that day, the 20th. And these Texian soldiers were happy to do so. They were indeed hungry and worn out on that cold gray morning. They were a ragged and worn out bunch. One of a group of 9 recruits that arrived the next morning described them as, quote, unwashed and unshaven, their hair, beards, and mustaches untrimmed and matted, and their clothes were in tatters and plastered with mud. Their diet up to that point of getting those supplies had consisted mainly of boiled beef, so the flour for bread and coffee found in the Mexican supplies from the captured boat were great additions to the cattle they began to slaughter that morning. The cattle that the men slaughtered to ease their hunger belonged to the McCormicks. 22 years later, Thomas M. Hardiman, a veteran of the battle, would credit Mrs. McCormick's cattle with providing the foundation for the winning of independence and the establishment of the Republic of Texas's government. Houston recognized that the position that he was at had some issues. If things took a wrong turn, he needed to have a contingency plan, and as commander, he had to consider such things and the variety of barges, flatboats, and rafts that they had found floating in Buffalo Bayou could potentially be used as an escape route if the Napoleon of the West proved to be as great a commander as his ego announced. Delgado, who was with Santa Anna, provides this account of the Mexican army's actions leading up to the moments that the 2 armies finally met. He wrote, on the 19th, His Excellency ordered Captain Barragan to start with a detachment of dragoons to reconnoiter Houston's movements. We halted at that place, all being quiet. On the 20th, at about 8 o'clock a.m., everything was ready for the march. We had burnt a fine warehouse on the wharf and all the houses in the town when Captain Barragan rushed in at full speed, reporting that Houston was close on our rear and that his troops had captured some of our stragglers and had disarmed and dispatched them. There is in front of New Washington a dense wood through which runs a narrow lane about a half league in length, allowing passage to pack mules in single file only and to mounted men in double file. This lane was filled with our pickets, the drove of mules, and the remainder of the detachment. His Excellency and staff were still in the town. Upon hearing Barragan's report, he leapt upon his horse and galloped at full speed for the lane, which, being crowded with men and mules, did not afford him as prompt an exit as he wished. However, knocking down one and riding over another, he overcame the obstacles, shouting at the top of his voice, "The enemy are coming! The enemy are coming!" The excitement of the general-in-chief had such a terrifying effect on the men that every face turned pale. Order could no longer be preserved, and every man thought of flight or finding a hiding place and gave up all idea of fighting. Upon reaching the prairie, a column of attack was formed with trepidation and confusion, amid incoherent movements and contradictory orders. At this moment, His Excellency did me the honor to place me in command of the artillery and ordnance, giving me his orders verbally, with strict injunctions as to my responsibility. And that's the end of the quote by Delgado. Thomas J. Rusk, again, who was Secretary of War and serving in the Army at that time, described the events that occurred in his report that he wrote to President Burnett. He wrote, "Our army, under the command of General Houston, arrived here on the 20th. The enemy, a few miles off at New Washington, apprised of our arrival, committed some depredations upon private property and commenced their line of march to this point. They were unconscious of our approach until our standard was planted on the banks of the San Jacinto. Our position was a favorable one for battle. On the noon of the 20th, the appearance of the foe was hailed by our soldiers with enthusiasm." So here you have the setting. Houston and his men were spread out in the trees when Santa Anna and his soldiers arrived at about 11:30 to noon. And the soldiers commanded by Santa Anna consisted of veteran companies from Guadalajara, Toluca, Aldama, Guerrero, and Matamoros, as well as inexperienced peasant conscripts pressed into service by the army as it journeyed through their regions on the way to Texas. Most were equipped with the Brown Bess, the standard .75 caliber English flintlock musket that had a shorter range than most of the Texian's rifles. It shot about 50 yards somewhat accurately, is my understanding. More importantly, though, they were equipped with bayonets, which was essential for close combat. The infantry were also armed with sabers. The cavalry also had sabers as well as pistols. They wore dress uniforms of red and blue with white leather accoutrements and white and gold trim, along with being supplied with white cotton fatigue uniforms. Approaching Mexican scouts saw the Texian pickets from the plain of San Jacinto, and the mounted scouts rushed away to a southward grove of trees while the Texians attempted to conceal themselves. About 1 o'clock, Sidney Sherman returned from a reconnaissance to inform Houston that the Mexican cavalry was about a mile away. The Mexican dragoons came into sight, and Houston instructed his men to lay on the ground to conceal their numbers. According to one source, as the Mexican dragoons closed in, Houston declared in a loud voice, "Clear the guns and fire." Now, the cannons did not fire. They were not yet sighted properly, but Houston's cry, according to this source, halted the dragoons' approach, and they returned to the main body of the Mexican army. Then sharpshooters from the veteran Toluca company maneuvered to a grove of trees within gunshot range of the Texian camp, and the Mexican army positioned El Volcan, the one cannon that they had brought with them, and they set it up in a timbered spot, and they began to fire grape shot at the rebels and pirates who were obscured in the wooded encampment. It did no damage to the Texians since its aim was also too elevated. This time, the Texian artillery did respond. Artillery fire continued sporadically into the afternoon while Santa Anna and his army set up camp on the high ground above the marshes of the San Jacinto. The exchange of artillery fire did little actual damage to either army. Apparently, one Mexican soldier and one Texian soldier suffered injuries. Unfortunately, the Texian was the commander of the artillery, Colonel J.C. Neal. Hockley would be tapped to take over for the wounded former commander of the Alamo. Now, this was the moment the Texians had been waiting for, was it not? The moment to unleash their pent-up desire for vengeance? It was time for Houston to cry havoc and let slip the Texian dogs of war. The Mexican skirmishers had begun to withdraw along with their cannon. The cannon moved slowly, and some thought that they should go after it. But it wasn't the moment for General Houston. Now, Kentuckian Colonel Sidney Sherman was ready to take action and argued that he should be allowed to. And so, as an act of compromise, Houston finally agreed that he could take some mounted men out on a reconnaissance, but under no circumstances were Sherman and the 61 mounted riflemen to engage. But things went wrong, as they often do, and when the reconnaissance party went out beyond Houston's view, he and the army heard firing. Houston conveyed what happened when the Mexican army arrived in the following dispatch to President Barnett, and this was written on the 20th from Camp Safety, San Jacinto, Lynch's Crossing. Mr. President, dear sir, This morning, the Army reached this point and was attacked at 11:30 a.m. by the Army of Santa Anna, which continued until 3 o'clock, when he withdrew his forces from the field. Our men were few who engaged the enemy, the balance remaining concealed for the purpose of hiding our number. His force is reported at 800. Ours does not exceed 750. I am disposed to think that the enemy intend another attack tonight by a change of position. We had but one man wounded. The enemy's loss is estimated from 18 to 20. There would be no difficulty in securing the rights of the people and the liberties of Texas if men would march to their duty and not fly like recreants from danger. Texas must be defended and liberty maintained. Sam Houston, Commander-in-Chief. P.S. Santa Anna was in the field. The officers and soldiers acted well. Colonel Rusk was in the action and fully met my wishes. Now, there are quite a few details that Houston left out of the message to President Barnett. Instead of just doing a reconnaissance, once they got beyond line of sight, Sherman ordered a charge. And after their initial assault, Sherman and his men dismounted to reload, as was the need to do with that kind of weapon. Then came the Mexican cavalry, armed with sabers and lances, followed by about 100 infantrymen. El Volcan launched grape shot at the Texians, and Mexican bugle played no quarter. Sherman called for reserves to come to his aid, but Houston would not allow any more of his men to put themselves into harm's way. He was not ready to fight yet. So Sherman and his men would have to fight back through to the Texian line. In the process, 3 men were wounded and they lost several horses. Alwyn J. Trask, Devereaux J. Woodleaf, and Walter P. Lane were injured in the skirmish. And Trask died almost a month later from his injuries. Sherman never forgave Houston for not sending assistance, and he resented Houston's treatment of him upon his party's return to the trees. Now, Tennessee-born Captain Jesse Billingsley did not obey Houston's command to remain in the wooded area and chose to lead his men to Sherman's aid. He later remembered, quote, seeing, meaning Sherman's horsemen, under a heavy fire and receiving no orders from General Houston to go to their support, I determined to go voluntarily and accordingly led out the first company of the 1st Regiment. Soon the entire regiment under Colonel Burleson followed. On the way to assist, they had to pass by General Houston, who ordered them to countermarch, to go back, do not engage. Billingsley recalled, quote, this order the men treated with derision, requesting him to countermarch himself, if he desired it, and steadily held on their way to the support of Colonel Sherman and succeeded in driving the enemy behind their breastworks. But there was one more act of daring that occurred. Mirabeau Lamar, a Georgia native, who in the future would also be a thorn in Houston's side, had joined up with the Texans only a little while before, but he had come ready to fight. He had also come to seize his part of the promised opportunity that Texas represented for so many people that had come to Texas, and he began to seize it by distinguishing himself in this brief skirmish. He rescued 2 wounded men, killed a Mexican soldier in close combat, and assisted Secretary of War Thomas Rusk, who had found himself in a tight spot. Rusk found himself surrounded by lancers, and when at the point of death or capture, Lamar rode into the melee on his stallion and rescued the Secretary of War. While Sherman's men sought to return to their own lines, 19-year-old Irish-born Walter Lane was dismounted by a lance in the shoulder. As he attempted to make his way on foot, the lancers gave chase and closed in. Lamar blocked their advance and shot one with his pistol. Henry Carnes rode to Lane's rescue, and the 3 rode to the safety of their brothers in arms. The Mexican dragoons actually applauded Lamar for his bravery and his horsemanship, and he is said to have returned their acknowledgement with a bow and returned to his fellow Texas soldiers as well. For his actions, Lamar was promoted from private to colonel and given a command over the cavalry. Walter Lane, who was in the battle and was one of the ones wounded, offered his memory of the event at a later time. It's important to bear in mind that a lot of the recollections were written down at quite a bit of time after the actual event. So there might be some discrepancies. And there are often discrepancies, especially when you have a large number of people involved from different perspectives. But Lane remembered that that evening, meaning the 20th of April, 1836, Colonel Sherman went out to field the enemy with some 200 cavalry. We got in half a mile of their line when their cavalry came out to interview us. They got within 200 yards, halted, and formed. The officers rode out in front, waved their swords, and cried, "Americanas, vene usted, come here." We did. The word was passed. "All are ready for a charge. All ready. Charge," rang out, and we went through them like a stroke of lightning, chased them back to their infantry, and then fell back out of their fire. They reinforced and followed us out, challenged us again. We charged, routed, and drove them back on their infantry the second time. My horse, a powerful animal, had got excited, and having more zeal than discretion, took the bit in his teeth and ran me headlong into the midst of the enemy, much to my disgust. The order was given to retreat. I was unanimously in favor of it, but my horse wanted to go through. A Mexican officer settled the difficulty by cutting at my head with his saber. I threw up my gun and warded off the blow. My gun was empty. I drew a holster pistol, aimed at his head, and pulled trigger. It missed fire. He tucked his head down to avoid the shot when I hit him over the head with the pistol, knocking him senseless. Just then, a big Mexican lancer charged me in the side, running me through the shoulder with his lance, observing, "Carajo Americana, damn the Americans," and knocked me 10 feet off my horse. I fell on my head, stunned and senseless. General Amar rode up to succor me, shot the Mexican, and, thinking I was dead, fell back with the command. My comrades had got some 40 yards retreating when I regained consciousness and my feet at the same time. 20 Mexicans were around me when I rose, but it so surprised them to see a dead boy rise to his feet and run like a buck that I got 10 steps before they fired at me. Captain Carnes saw me coming and ordered his company to wheel and fire on my pursuers, which they did, killing a few when the balance halted. An old man told me, "Son, get up behind. I reckon the old Mar can take us both out." I did. She was a sorrel mare and thin in flesh. I would know her hide if it were dried on a fence even now, and she had the sharpest backbone it has ever been my fortune to straddle. General Houston, thinking we were bringing on a general engagement, sent out his infantry to support us. We got behind them, but as the enemy retired, both parties went back to camp. Dr. Good, our orderly sergeant, dressed my wound. It was not dangerous but painful. The lance had gone nearly through my shoulder blade. Lane would fight the next day in the battle, and as you see, he was under the recollection that Houston had ordered out some help, whereas other sources say that Houston did not allow people to go out, but Billingsley just went out on his own will. Another participant in the April 20th engagement, Oliver T. Brown, wrote, "We traveled 1,000 miles on foot in Texas before we got in gunshot of the enemy. But then we gave them hell on the 20th of April. The great General Santa Anna, at the head of 600 choice Mexican troops and a number of his bravest generals, I shall state to you that we elected Captain Sherman, colonel of the 2nd Regiment. He selected 70 horsemen out of the different regiments to make the attack. I, being 3rd Sergeant in our company, I was selected as one of the horsemen. On the 20th at 4 o'clock, we attacked the enemy. We killed about 20 and only had 2 men wounded on the first day. Then we retreated to our camp, waited for them to make an attack until 4 o'clock on the 21st. George Erath, who I mentioned earlier, was born and educated in Austria, recalled the moment with eloquent detail. He wrote, "Apprehensions were expressed that General Houston did not intend to fight there and might retreat further. To such a course, general resistance was announced. By his long retreat, Houston had made himself extremely unpopular, especially with the Western men, who in consequence of it had had their property destroyed, houses burned, and land devastated. But about 3 o'clock, the cavalry was thrown forward for a reconnaissance. Our regiment with one cannon followed a short distance to cover the reaction and took position in a small grove at the head of a shallow ravine on a plain incline toward the Mexican camp and in full view of it. Our cavalry came into action, moving from right to left, then turned and passed back on our left, carrying with them one of our men severely wounded. The Mexicans made a deploy as if to advance on us, but after the firing of several cannon on each side without any effect on us, retreated to their position. We too returned to camp. This maneuver disclosed the Mexican strength as considerably inferior to ours and their position as badly chosen for their defense. The cry for attacking then became more unanimous, with the determination to retreat no further, and it was only by the advice and example of a sprinkle of old men among us, some of whom had been in the Revolutionary War and that of 1812, that we kept order and discipline to await the developments of next day. The night passed off comparatively quiet, with occasional cannon shots on either side, the enemies going far over us, as perhaps ours did over them, for their position was now in a bayou slightly protected by a low rise of the ground 300 yards in front. Rusk also gave additional details in his report. He wrote, "The enemy marched in good order, took a position in front of our encampment on an eminence with an end cannon shot, where they planted their only piece of artillery, a brass 9-pounder, and then arranged their cavalry and infantry a short distance on the right under the shelter of a skirt of woods. In a short time they commenced firing upon us, their cannon in front, their infantry on our left, and their cavalry changing the position on the right. A charge was made on the left of our camp by this infantry, which was promptly repelled by a few shots of our artillery, which forced them to retire. We have the satisfaction of stating that only 2 of our men were wounded, one very slightly, and the other, Colonel Neal of the artillery, not fatally. The attack ceased, the enemy retired and formed in 2 pieces skirt of timber, and remained in that position, occasionally opening their cannon up on us until just before sunset, when they attempted to draw off their forces. The artillery and cavalry were removed to other points. Colonel Sherman, with 60 of our cavalry, charged upon theirs, consisting of upwards of 100, killing and wounding several. Their infantry came to the assistance of their cavalry and opened upon us an incessant firing for 10 or 15 minutes, which our men sustained with unprecedented firmness. Too much praise cannot be bestowed upon those who were engaged in this charge, for never was one of equal peril made with more courage and determined with less loss. 2 of our men were severely wounded, but none killed. This terminated the movements of the day." And Houston also provided more detail in his official report of the engagement. He wrote, "I have the honor to inform you that on the evening of the 18th instant, after a forced march of 55 miles, which was effected in 2 days and a half, the army arrived opposite Harrisburg. That evening, a courier of the enemy was taken, from whom I learned that General Santa Anna, with 1 division of his choice troops, had marched in the direction of Lynch's Ferry on the San Jacinto, burning Harrisburg as it passed down. The army was ordered to be in readiness to march early on the next morning. The main body effected a crossing over Buffalo Bayou below Harrisburg on the morning of the 19th, having left the baggage, the sick, and a sufficient camp guard in the rear. We continued the march throughout the night, making but 1 halt in the prairie for a short time and without refreshment. At daylight, we resumed the line of march, and in a short distance our scouts encountered those of the enemy, and we received information that General Santa Anna was at New Washington and would that day take up his line of march for Anahuac, crossing at Lynch's. The Texian army halted within half a mile of the ferry and some timber, and were engaged in slaughtering beeves, when the army of General Santa Anna was discovered to be approaching in battle array, having been encamped at Clopper's Point 8 miles below. Disposition was immediately made of our forces in preparation for his reception. He took a position with his infantry and artillery in the center, occupying an island of timber, his cavalry covering the left flank. Their artillery then opened upon our encampment, consisting of 1 double fortified medium brass 12-pounders. The infantry in columns advanced with the design of charging our lines, but were repulsed by a discharge of grape and canister from our artillery, consisting of one double fortified 2 6-pounders. The enemy had occupied a piece of timber within rifle shot of the left wing of our army, from which an occasional interchange of small arms took place between the troops, until the enemy withdrew to a position on the bank of the San Jacinto, about 3/4 of a mile from our encampment, and commenced a fortification. A short time before sunset, our mounted men, about 85 in number, under the special command of Colonel Sherman, marched out for the purpose of reconnoitering the enemy. Whilst advancing, they received a volley from the left of the enemy's infantry, and after a sharp reconnoiter with their cavalry, in which ours acted extremely well and performed some feats of daring chivalry, they retired in good order, having had 2 men severely wounded and several horses killed. In the meantime, the infantry under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Millard and Colonel Burleson's regiment with artillery had marched out for the purpose of covering the retreat of the cavalry, if necessary. All then fell back in good order to our encampment about sunset and remained without any ostensible action until the 21st at 3:30, taking the first refreshment which they had enjoyed for 2 days. The enemy, in the meantime, having extended the right flank of their infantry so as to occupy the extreme points of a skirt of timber on the bank of the San Jacinto, and secured their left by a fortification about 5 feet high, constructed of packs and baggage, leaving an opening in the center of the breastwork in which their artillery was placed, their cavalry upon their left wing. And to be extremely thorough, we should also consider Colonel Delgado's account that gives us a different perspective of the same events from the Mexican side. He wrote, "Meanwhile, the officers having dismounted and taken their stations in front of their commands, we moved in search of the enemy, with flankers on both sides to explore the woods, as the knapsacks might impede the movements of the men. His Excellency ordered that they should be dropped on the road, still preserving our formation. The order was obeyed, the knapsacks being left in the keeping of Providence or fortune, and we resumed our march. It was 2:00 p.m. when we descried Houston's pickets at the edge of a large wood in which he concealed his main force. Our skirmishers commenced firing, when they were answered by the enemy, who fell back into the wood. His Excellency reached the ground with the main body with the intention, as I understood, of attacking at once, but they kept hidden, which kept him from ascertaining their position. He therefore changed his dispositions and ordered the company of Toluca to deploy as skirmishers in the direction of the woods. Our cannon, established on a small elevation, opened its fire. The enemy responded with a discharge of grape, which wounded severely Captain Ureza and killed his horse. At this moment, His Excellency came to me and ordered me to unload the ordnance stores and to turn over the 20 mules on which they were packed to Captain Barragon, who was instructed to bring in the knapsacks that had been left on the road. I was cautious enough to part with only 18 mules, keeping 2 for an emergency. Then His Excellency went to look for a camping ground and established his whole force along the shore of San Jacinto Bay, at least 1 mile from the place where I had been left. About 1 hour later, I received orders through Colonel Bringas to come into camp immediately with the ordnance stores and the piece of artillery. That officer was also the bearer of an order to the company of Toluca, the only force that checked the enemy, to fall back likewise. I observed to Colonel Bringas that would take some time to execute this order, the chests, as His Excellency knew, being piled up on the ground, and I only having 2 mules upon to load them, and that, furthermore, if the company of Toluca left me unsupported, the enemy would probably pounce upon the stores, all of which would go to the devil. Colonel Bringas advised me to do best I could, adding that I ought to know that no observations could be made to His Excellency, and he had no desire to argue with him in the raving state of mind in which he was. The colonel parted from me, followed by the company of Toluca. It may well be imagined that when the enemy saw our artillery and stores unprotected, he paid them special attention. He established his cannon in such a manner as to disable our gun and to support an attack should it take place. Their first shot shattered the caisson on the limber, and another scattered about our ordnance boxes. Another again killed 2 fine mules, and they kept annoying us during the 2 long hours it took me to remove, with only 2 mules, 40 and odd boxes of ammunition. How the general-in-chief had endangered the whole division. I acknowledged that I had never been within such danger. What would have become of me in consequence of the general's order the enemy had captured our artillery and ordnance stores, as he might have done, unsupported as it was? I had no resource left but to make the best defense I could with my gun. For this purpose, I instructed Lieutenant Arenal to have it loaded with grape and not to fire until the enemy came in close range, in order both to spare ammunition and to intimidate the assailants. At length, at 5:00 p.m., my duty was performed, and as I entered the camp with the last load, I was closely followed by the enemy's cavalry. His Excellency, noticing it, instructed me to order Captain Aguirre, who commanded our cavalry, to face the enemy without gaining ground. This movement checked the enemy for a few moments, but soon after they dashed upon our dragoons and were close enough to engage them with the sword, without, however, any material result. Then, His Excellency, deploying several companies as skirmishers, forced the enemy back to his camp, on which he retired sluggishly and in disorder. This engagement took place after sundown. Now, Creed Taylor, who had gone AWOL to attend to his family in the runaway scrape, heard these events from afar as he rushed to join the army, or I should say rejoin. The following in his record, he wrote, "Securing fresh horses, which were had for the asking, we set out to overtake the Texan army. En route, we fell in with Captain Tomlinson and a few other settlers, and we all pushed forward with much haste. When we reached the smoking debris of Harrisburg, which had just been burned by the Mexicans, we learned the whereabouts of Houston's forces and the close proximity of the Mexican army to the Texan camp. Our horses were becoming greatly jaded, but we could not brook the thought of being too late for a fight with an expletive about the Mexicans soldiers. So we pushed on with all possible speed. In the afternoon of April 20th, when within a few miles of the seat of war, we heard heavy artillery fire and were quite sure the fight was on. It chagrined us deeply to think that we were not in the fracas. Spurring forward in a gallop, we reached the Texan camp near sundown and were overjoyed to meet our comrades and to learn that we still had prospects of engaging the enemy in a real battle at any moment. General Sherman's men had just come out of a skirmish with the Mexican cavalry and were entertaining groups of eager listeners with accounts of what they had seen and done while out reconnoitering. The general opinion was that a real fight was brewing, inevitable. That was the end of combat on April 20th, and the two armies established their camps. The enemies were about a mile apart, a plain of tall grass stretching between them. The Mexican army camped with the marsh and Peggy's Lake to their rear. The open prairie stretched out before them. General Houston posted sentries for the night and ordered the rest of the Texian army to get as much rest and nourishment as they could. He himself had not had a good night's sleep in weeks, and no one knew what was going to happen the next day. As the Texas army bedded down for the night after the exciting events of April 20th, Houston had a lot to think about. Would his men fight? Would they be able to stand the test, as reckless and as undisciplined as they have often been described, against a real army? What if Santa Anna launched a night attack or early pre-dawn attack? What if anything went wrong? Houston knew that many of the men had little respect for him. He'd heard the grumblings, and he'd borne the outright disrespect and questionings of his decisions from his officers, making compromises when he could. Some considered him a coward, always retreating, never taking a stand. Sam Houston famously loved the Iliad and committed passages of Pope's translation to memory. As the good apostle wrote, only God and man himself know that man's true thinking. But we can wonder and contemplate based on what we do know. Houston had been to war. He had distinguished himself in combat serving under Old Hickory Andrew Jackson, who was then President of the United States. Even then, as he commanded the Texas Army, he still bore the never completely healed wounds that he had suffered in his active service and rash bravery under Andrew Jackson. He no doubt contemplated and had been contemplating the violent ends and bloody combat experienced by the defenders of the Alamo and the cold-blooded executions performed under the guise of false pretenses at Goliad, as some have presented it. And did he lend moments to remember the stories of death and glory etched into the heritage of Western civilization and his own memory by the words of the Greek poet? It's impossible to know, but if you spend a lifetime reading and rereading a book, that book becomes a part of you. For the Iliad is a book about death. Homer wrote, "Generations of men are like the leaves. In winter, winds blow them down to earth. But then, when spring season comes again, the budding wood grows more. And so with men, one generation grows, another dies away." Would this generation of unruly and rebellious Texians he commanded grow, or would it tomorrow die away as had the commands of Travis and Fannin? What would be his and their fate? Because Homer also knew about it, writing, "And fate, no one alive has ever escaped it, neither brave man nor coward. I tell you, it's born with us the day that we are born." Houston had tried to give the men some training. He had tried to instill some sense of discipline into them. Rain and mud and never enough food had made tempers high. He, by moving away from Santa Ana, constantly away, had sought a better option than defeat. But this damned weather had been no help. Was this the place? Would it be across the river? Santa Ana's men had faced the same challenges as his men had faced. Bad weather, poor supplies, and Santa Ana had become separated from his much larger main army group. They were on near equal terms, it appeared. What would the Mexicans do? Would they attack at dawn? There was much to ponder as he rested his head that night on a coil of artillery rope beneath a tree. Meanwhile, across the prairie, Santa Ana considered the same questions. Would an attack come with the rising sun or just before? He and his army had pushed far into Texian territory and was separated from the bulk of his army, for the first time facing a Texian force of comparative size to his own. When would his reinforcements arrive? What would the morning bring? Would the next day be the day he finally rid Mexico of these invaders and pirates? He also set pickets to watch and ordered his soldiers to rest in battle formations with weapons at the ready. Tired, it must have been difficult to sleep in battle formation with weapons in their hands. This had not happened during the campaign. They had always been at the advantage. Both men, Santa Ana and Sam Houston, had much to consider that night. And for both, after an exhausting night, the answer was anticlimactic. When the sun began to rise just before 6 a.m., nothing happened. There was no attack. And from Santa Ana's perspective, it probably appeared that Houston was once again afraid to face him. The Mexican camp was able to relax. And then something did happen at about 9:30 in the morning when Santa Ana's brother-in-law arrived. On the morning of April 21st, General Cos arrived with about 500 men. Now, Santa Ana had given orders for the best of the best to reinforce him, but most of them were raw recruits from San Luis and Saltillo. These men, exhausted by the fast march, were not the best of the best, but their arrival did give him a numerical advantage. They increased Santa Ana's strength to about 1,400, but they were tired and they were hungry and they had not eaten in 24 hours. Colonel Delgado gives us a good description of the events in the Mexican camp. At daybreak on the 21st, His Excellency ordered a breastwork to be erected for the cannon. It was constructed with pack saddles, sacks of hard bread, baggage, etc. A trifling barricade of branches ran along its left and right. The camping ground of selection was in all respects against rules. Any youngster could have done better. We had the enemy on our right in a wood at long musket range. Our front, though level, exposed to the fire of the enemy, who could keep up with impunity from his sheltered position. Delgado also said our own troops had no space for maneuvering. We had in our rear a small grove reaching to the bay shore, which extended on our right as far as New Washington. What ground had we to retreat up in case of a reverse? From sad experience, I answer none. A few hours before the engagement, I submit to General Castrillon a few remarks on the subject suggested by my limited knowledge, but he answered, "What can I do, my friend? I know it well, but I cannot help it. You know that nothing avails here against the caprice, arbitrary will, and ignorance of that man." This was said in an impassioned voice and in close proximity to His Excellency's tent. At 9:00 a.m., General Coase came in with reinforcement of about 500 men. His arrival was greeted by the roll of drums and with joyful shouts. As it was represented to His Excellency that these men had not slept the night before, he instructed them to stack their arms, remove their accoutrements, and go to sleep quietly in the adjoining grove. End of quote by Delgado. So when Coase first arrived, Santa Anna apparently had become excited and was again ready to attack. He wanted to attack. Coase, brother-in-law to His Excellency, spoke with the commander and convinced him that the newly arrived men would not be of any benefit to him if they attacked immediately. They were allowed to rest as a result of this intervention. Coase set up camp to the north toward the marshes, and with no apparent sign of danger, they were allowed to sleep and get a much-needed rest. And the rest of the Mexican army, after a stressful night readying for combat, also relaxed. No officer ordered sentries to keep watch, which was odd, and Santa Anna relaxed in his tent while soldiers throughout the camp ate, rested, and played cards. Now, on the other side of the field, after the arrival of Coase and his men, Deaf Smith, either at Houston's order or with Houston's approval of Smith's suggestion, proceeded to destroy the bridge that the Mexican army had used to reach the area, Vince's Bridge. If things went right, the Mexican army would be trapped and could no longer be reinforced. If things went wrong, it would be the Texans stuck in a snare. But it was a gamble. It's a game that they were playing, trying to make the right move. And Smith and a small party carefully traveled the 8 miles to do their work of destruction and make a safe return to camp in time to join in on the attack. Many years later, in 1858, in a letter, young Perry Alsbury shared his memory of this event. And he wrote, "On the morning of the 21st of April, 1836, Captain Carnes's cavalry company, commonly called Deaf Smith's Spy Company, were drawn up in line on the edge of General Houston's position, as well as I recollect. We were between 30 and 40 strong. The Mexican cavalry, whom we fought the evening before, at that moment were drawn up in line on the south of our position, about 600 yards distant. I think they were from 60 to 80 strong. They seemed to invite us again to combat, but prudence, in my humble opinion, dictated to our leaders a different course than to engage them at that moment. While sitting in our saddles, John Coker, my left file leader, made the following remark and the suggestions following. Boys, before many hours, we will have one of the damnedest, bloodiest fights that ever was fought, and I believe it would be a good plan to go and burn that bridge so as not only to impede the advanced reinforcements of the enemy, but it will cut off all chance of retreat of either party." The proposition was seconded by the whole company when Deaf Smith proposed to go and see the general and get his approval to the enterprise. Word for word of what passed between our leaders I am not able to repeat, except that Smith told us Houston asked him, "Can you do it without being cut to pieces by the Mexican cavalry?" Smith said that he replied to Houston, "Give me 6 men and I will try." On Smith's return to our little party, he stopped about the center, facing us, and in the saddle some questions were asked him, as, "What did the general say?" He made no answer then, but after surveying us from right to left with an iron-like countenance, he said, "I want 6 men. I am going to burn the bridge. I want 6 men who are willing to follow me through or perish in the attempt." There was silence for several moments as 6 of us dropped out of the little line and volunteered to follow our favorite chief. But let me here do justice to the remainder of our companions in arms by saying and believing what I say, that there were scarcely a man of our spy company who would not have volunteered to follow Deaf Smith had each and all been well mounted. I will here mention the names of all who joined Deaf Smith in the enterprise, yet before doing so, beg leave to state that I differ from the opinion of my old friend, Uncle Jack Coker, as we called him, as to the name of one of the party, but having the most implicit confidence in Uncle Jack's honesty, I am willing to risk his statement and give the names as he has set them down. Deaf Smith, Denmore Bives, John Coker, Y.P. Alsbury, Rainwater, John Garner, Lapham, 7 in all. We were compelled to pass within gunshot of the extreme left of the Mexican cavalry, who were drawn out, as stated, with their left wing reaching within gunshot of Buffalo Bayou, up which we had to go to reach the bridge, situated some 8 or 9 miles on the road leading to the Brazos. It being understood that we would maneuver so as to pass the Mexican horse, if possible, without a fight, the remainder of our company followed slowly, under a soldier's pledge that were we attacked by the cavalry, they would come to our assistance. Our main body maneuvered with the feint of an engagement so that we passed to the rear, unmolested some distance when our comrades regained the camp, leaving the enemy to enjoy the belief that we were too cowardly to fight. We moved rapidly till reaching the mouth of the lane, on the north side of which was situated the double log house before occupied by Mr. Vince. We filed off to the left so as to avoid an ambuscade, should the enemy be concealed within the dwelling. We threw down the fence where it joined Vince's bayou, over which the bridge was built. 150 yards more, and we were at the bridge, over which Deaf Smith and myself passed with the view of reconnoitering, leaving the remainder of our party to strike fire and make the necessary preparations for burning the bridge on our return. We had gone about a half mile when we noticed in the sandy soil the track of a carriage wheel. Smith, with a countenance of mixed rage and disappointment, exclaimed, "Santa Anna has made his escape. Here is his carriage track, going back, pulled by mules in great hurry." I proposed to him that we should gallop on about 1 mile to a difficult crossing of another bayou where we might get the honor of helping him to cross. He replied, "My orders are to burn the bridge and return as quick as possible." In a few minutes, we were at the bridge, where we found our comrades prepared the fire and plenty of dry rails and wood. In a few minutes, the bridge was in flames. If I recollect aright, it was built of cedar. Nothing of interest occurred till we reached the first deep dry hollow, 1/2 or 3/4 of a mile above our camp, when an incident happened which goes to illustrate strongly the extraordinary sagacity of that masterly man, Deaf Smith. After ordering a halt, he observed, "I will ride up to the high ground next to camp, far enough to see whether any of the Mexican horsemen are near, so that we may avoid them." Our eyes were bent on our leader, as we suddenly saw him drop down on the mane of his horse and turn toward us. When up to us, the question was asked, "What news?" When, with an eye and a countenance I shall never forget, he said, "The prairie is filled with Mexican horse. I cannot see how or where they got their reinforcements from." Eyeing every man with the eye of a tiger, he asked, "What shall we do?" We told him, "You are our leader, and we shall follow you. Let your course be forward or back. My orders are to return to camp. I will do it or die." But, eyeing every one of us with a scrutiny even painful, he said, "If there is one or more of you prefers making your escape, I now give you leave." We loved our leader almost as we did our country, and replied to him again, "Lead on, we follow." A change, I thought, then came over his countenance, as I discovered his terrible eye moistened with a tear. He asked, "Are your arms all right?" He then added, "We will go down the dry hollow to where it joins the bayou, and then, in Indian file, run to the level above, which will bring us in about 100 yards of the enemy's extreme left. When discovered by them, we will raise the Texan yell and charge at full speed through their lines. They will, no doubt, kill me, my bogs, but by God, I will make an opening for the rest of you to pass." Such was the plan. Understood. And, sir, I have heard men say that they could meet such scenes with cool indifference, but, sir, they are braver than I profess to be, although I must say, and when I say it, do so with candor and truth, that not one of Smith's men would have preferred the risk of death, but rather than an ignominious, disgraceful desertion of the leader we all loved. But to conclude, when fairly on the level which commanded a partial view of both armies, we saw no Mexican cavalry, but knew from the hearty laugh of our leader that he had, as he boastingly said, put our fidelity to the test. For my part, I felt well satisfied that I had saved my credit for courage without having the work to do, and doubt not but my companions felt as I did. That ends his account of the burning of the Vince's Bridge. James Washington Winters also recalled the events of that morning. He remembered years later, he wrote, "The next morning, April 21st, a council of war was held. Sometime before noon, Houston passed around among the men gathered at the campfires and asked if we wanted to fight. We replied with a shout that we were most anxious to do so. Then Houston replied, 'Very well, get your dinners and I will lead you into the fight. And if you whip them, every one of you shall be a captain.' There had been so many split-ups and differences that Houston preferred the opinions of the men themselves, feeling that before hazarding battle, we must find whether they would enter the engagement with a will. For the men had marched so long without food or rest that perhaps they might not be physically prepared. I never heard orders given as to Vince's Bridge. I heard that Deaf Smith had asked permission to cut it down. I never heard that Vince's Bridge was mentioned in any address to the army or any prominence given to the fact that it had been destroyed." Okay, so after Coase arrived to reinforce Santa Anna, Adjutant General John Wharton offered words of encouragement up and down the line. He said that there was only one course of action: attack at once. Physician Nicholas Labadie, originally from Windsor, Ontario, claimed that Wharton said, "Boys, there is no other word today but fight, fight. Now is the time." As noon drew close, Wharton and Houston conversed. What was said is unknown, but it is reported that Houston's final sentence to Wharton was, "Fight and be damned." Houston then did something he had never done during his command of the Texas Army. He called a council of war with Colonels Edward Burleson and Sidney Sherman and Lieutenant Colonels Henry Millard, Alexander Somerville, and Joseph L. Bennett, and Major Lysander Wells. Secretary of War was also present at the council of war. Houston asked, "Shall we attack the enemy in position or receive the attack on our own?" Rusk said, "To attack veteran troops with raw militia is a thing unheard of. To charge upon the enemy without bayonets in an open prairie has never been known. Our situation is strong. In it, we can whip all Mexico." Now, there's a record in the papers of the Texas Revolution that show the results of the Council of War. It's listed as if it's a vote. And it says Colonel Burleson, Colonel Sherman, Lieutenant Colonel Millard, Lieutenant Colonel Somerville were against fighting. Lieutenant Colonel Bennett and Major Wells were for fighting. And then it lists the vote and then said held about noon on the day of the battle. And on the opposite side of the paper, it says Council of War at San Jacinto, April 21st, 1836. So I think that the against fighting meant against attacking, for fighting, apparently from the Rusk's memory, was for attacking. And only 2 of them were for attacking, according to that record. And then it goes on and says, ordered Sherman on the 20th when he went out with the detachment not to bring on an engagement in any event. It is not true that Sherman got the officers to agree to support him. And despite the vote result in the council, at about noon on April 21st, Houston instructed his officers that the men must ready themselves for an attack. According to Wiseheart, Houston had decided to attack before the meeting. And according to the early comment that he had gone around to the actual men, if that is true, then he knew what the men wanted to do. He was taking stock of what the officers wanted to do. But when would the attack occur? George E. Rath provided the following memory of the events. And he said, sometime between 3 and 4 o'clock on the afternoon of the 21st, when everything seemed to be in quiet of suspense, I was moving about in front of a thicket on the top of the rise above our company, watching the Mexican camp, which could be overlooked from there. Colonel Burleson came galloping up alone. He had come along the line on the left of the regiment, riding somewhat away from the right, on a straight course to the camp, a little in advance of us, of what was called the Battalion of Regulars, about 100 men armed with muskets and bayonets. Burleson knew me familiarly. He said, George, you run down and tell your captain and the captains on the right to come up here instantly and meet me. Then he galloped on. I delivered the order, there being only 2 other captains in our ride, and was back immediately to the place myself. Within a few minutes, the captains and some of the lieutenants of the regiment were assembled there. If anyone besides myself, not a commissioned officer, was there, it was Kraft, the orderly sergeant of Billingsley's company. Burleson was back by the time they all got there, and dismounting, he addressed his officers in about these words. Gentlemen, I have called you together. Fight we must. The time is the question. Shall we attack instantly or in the morning? The officers of the other regiment are collected in council for the same purpose. After a pause, Captain M. Baker spoke, saying it was late in the day, the fight might be protracted, and moved that we attack at daylight, giving some other reasons and ideas. But his speech was short. No objections were made. His proposition was at once agreed to, and Burleson remounted and rode off in the direction of the other regiment. The officers dispersed, except Billingsley, my captain, and 3 or 4 who had sat down on the ground, and I continued to stand by, listening to what they had to say. In a few minutes, Burleson came dashing back to the place and said, Captains, parade your companies. The other regiment has decided to fight immediately. I don't want mine to be a minute behind. I have had occasion to tell this, which I have here repeated many times before when talking of the Battle of San Jacinto. I have never heard it disputed, but this consultation of officers has never been brought up to me in conversation by anyone else, nor have I found any allusion to such consultation in my reading of accounts of the battle. It indicated that the fight was brought about by the voice of the army. General Houston has always been accredited with having absolute control without counsel or advice. I do not know whether he demanded the consultation or sanctioned it, but it shows that he, too, was undecided as to the course of action at the time. And this goes on to show you how there was several discrepancies in the later years and arguments about what actually even occurred. But like I said, it's a large group of people, and some people weren't aware of everything going on. Others had different memories of it. Just trying to do the best we can to parse out what did happen. On April 21st, 1836, at about 3:30 in the afternoon, Sam Houston's army formed about 1,000-yard line at the edge of the woods in which they had encamped. The sun would set in about 4 hours at 6:52. Whatever was about to happen in the light of day must happen in that brief window of opportunity. The cool of the morning had been replaced by the warmth of the afternoon sun at their backs. They formed ranks in the trees. James Gillespie, a captain of the 2nd Regiment, recalled that General Houston mounted his gray horse and spoke to every captain as he rode down the line. Then the infantry, shielded by a grove of trees, marched forward out of camp in columns of twos, and then turned left to cross the field. Sidney Sherman commanded the 2nd Regiment on the left end of the line, close to the marshland, and the same side on which the Mexican army was encamped. Secretary of War Rusk, having been rescued the day before by the daring action of the Georgia poet Mirabeau Lamar, was again in Sherman's ranks. Captain Juan Seguin and his Tejano Volunteer Company were also with Sherman on the left. Edward Burleson commanded the 1st Regiment to the Sherman's right. George W. Hockley, who had served as the Inspector General for the Army, was in command of the 2 artillery pieces, the Twin Sisters, to the right, and a little forward of the 1st Regiment. Next in line was a 4-piece band and 4 companies of infantry commanded by Henry Millard. Finally, at the end of the line, came the newly minted Colonel Lamar and his command of 61 cavalrymen. They were positioned about a half-mile up the bayou to the right and would circle around to the south and strike the Mexican cavalry. A rise in the terrain covered the movements of the Texas Army as they quietly advanced. They came into view about 200 yards out of the barricades that the Mexican Army had erected, and it was about then they were first detected. A bugler on the right side of the Mexican encampment signaled the advance of the Texian enemy. Then the Texians advanced at double-quick time. Houston, riding before the main body of the army, waved his hat, and the cavalry advanced, as did the infantry and artillery, passing through the steep part of a ravine and then up a slope on the far side. Houston gave the order to fire the cannon. The men were to remain silent until the first volley, which was only to be fired on his order. Now was the time for sword and fire. Hockley launched an attack by the Twin Sisters. The cannons belched forth a deadly assault of shrapnel and broken horseshoes into the Mexican camp. As Shakespeare said, the cannons have their bowels full of wrath, and ready mounted as they spit forth their iron indignation against your walls. The small band, including a freedman called Dick the Drummer, and flutist Frederick Lemsky, who was either from Poland, Germany, or Czechoslovakia, struck up music of the love song, Will You Come to the Bower I Have Shaded for You. The lyrics by Irish poet Thomas Moore might have been on the minds of some of the attackers as they proceeded to their bloody work. Will you come to the bower I have shaded for you? Our bed shall be roses all spangled with dew. Will you, will you, will you, will you come to the bower? There, under the bower on roses you'll lie, with a blush on your cheek but a smile in your eye. Will you, will you, will you, will you smile, my beloved? The men kept low and held their fire as they advanced under fire. Then, 20 paces from the barricade, Houston ordered, kneel, shoot, low, fire. It was there, about 60 yards from the Mexican line, that the Texans finally fired their first shots. Many of the balls from that first volley did damage. Houston waved his hat so all could see as he ordered, forward, charge, remember the Alamo, remember Goliad. Colonel Sherman and the 2nd Regiment, including Secretary of War Thomas Rusk and Juan Seguin and the Tejano Volunteer Company, attacked the enemy to the left. They were the first to break through the Mexican army's line. They drove the Mexican right into the center. The Mexican soldiers broke ranks on their right flank, and the 2nd Regiment followed in hot pursuit. Captain Robert Calder, fighting with the 1st Regiment, later recalled that Sherman and the 2nd Regiment, quote, had the honor of breaking the right wing of the enemy before we attacked the center. Seguin and his compatriots are credited with capturing Martin Perfecto de Cos, Santa Anna's brother-in-law, and Colonel Juan N. Almonte. In the Mexican camp followers and their children panicked and ran about in search of fathers and husbands. The raw recruits also panicked and hindered the veterans who were seeking to set up a defense. Even the best Mexican shots had difficulty firing downhill at the rapidly moving attackers. Following the breakthrough of the 2nd Regiment, the rest of the line attacked the Mexican camp's breastworks. The battle cry of the Texians and Tejanos filled the air. Remember the Alamo. Remember Goliad. Recuerden de Alamo. Recuerden de Goliad. The battle cry filled many of the members of the Mexican army with terror, and they attempted to flee. Some Mexican troops attempted to respond to the attack. El Volcan, the Mexican artillery piece, fired a volley. General Manuel Fernandez Castrillon, the officer who had attempted to spare the lives of men at the Alamo, tried his best to organize the Mexican soldiers into forming a resistance. Thomas J. Rusk, the Secretary of War, tried to save Castrillon, but his efforts were in vain. A volley of Texian bullets cut Castrillon down. Lamar and the Texas cavalry surprised and overwhelmed Santa Anna's cavalry. Unmounted horses ran throughout the camp. The attack at the center of the line, breaking through the breastworks, became a matter of violent hand-to-hand life-or-death struggle. Rifles turned into cudgels, skulls cracking, bones breaking, throats cut, blades hacking, blood flowing, lives ending and souls departing under the coastal Texas afternoon sun. The fighting must have been intense. The Mexican soldiers stationed at the breastworks with El Volcan died fighting. One Texian soldier wrote, quote, "It will not do to say that the Mexicans were cowardly and would not fight. They fought long and well. They commenced firing upon us at the distance of 400 yards and kept it up incessantly until we had scaled their breastworks. Many of them stood in battle until their brains were dashed out with clubbed guns. Their bodies lay thick around their artillery. The man with the fuse was shot in the act of applying it, and the cannon was captured, loaded." Houston tried to direct the attack from out in front of the line. He had 2 horses shot out from beneath him. The second time his horse went down, a rifle ball had struck Houston's right ankle. Undeterred, he mounted again as his boot filled with blood. Within 18 minutes, the battle for control of the field was over. The breastworks had been breached, El Volcan was seized, and Burleson's volunteers and Millard's camp made it into the Mexican camp. Mexican soldiers fled into the marshes, in the north, into the bayou, into the open prairie. The final resistance occurred near the marshes at the back of the camp. Colonel Juan El Monte tried to rally some of the fleeing soldiers to no avail. The Texian attackers were too much for them. The battle, for all intents and purposes, was over. But the killing continued for at least an hour and a half. Houston and the officers tried to exert control over the men, but whatever discipline they had managed to maintain until the attack was gone. Houston gave Colonel William Allen command of a 15-man squad responsible for catching up with the pursuing Texans and stopping them from wanton killing. Houston wanted to get his men under control. What if more Mexican troops, aside from Coast, were on their way to join Santa Anna, even though the bridge had been destroyed? What if they could get through? What if 2,000 or 3,000 more under Filisola arrived? Eventually, the killing did slow. The Mexican soldiers that weren't slaughtered were gathered as prisoners and marched back. The Texians started to try to make sense of their situation. One very important question that remained unanswered at that point was this: where was Santa Anna? Was he among the dead? Had he been captured? Where was he? Santa Anna had escaped. What had he been doing in the tent while the Texian army silently stalked up through the prairie grass? The honest answer is we do not know. Leaving his tent, he witnessed chaos. He saw Houston sword in hand on the dappled gray horse. He put into action the words of Homer, better to flee from death and feel its grip. If he could reach the troops commanded by Filisola, perhaps he could return and finally crush these brash Texian pirates and land grabbers that were attempting to usurp the territorial authority of Mexico. He grabbed the reins of a horse, swung up into the saddle, and rode through the mayhem and din of war. He rode as if his life depended on it, because it did. A year later, trying to absolve himself of his failure, Santa Anna tried to blame others, including the slain Castrillon. But he absolved himself of any responsibility in this passage. Quote, "In view of Houston's march communicated to me by the advance guard at Lynchburg, I was now in a position to choose the location for battle. and I shut up the enemy in the low marshy angle of the country where its retreat was cut off by Buffalo Bayou and the San Jacinto. Their left was opposed by our right, protected by the woods on the banks of the bayou. Their right covered by our 6-pounder and my cavalry. I myself occupied the highest part of the terrain. Is this position compatible with the fatal lack of foresight of which I am accused? Everything favored our country and the cause which we were defending in its name. Lastly, in order that nothing be lacking to our good luck, the enemy was repulsed in a skirmish on the evening of the 20th, and it did not believe that the troops brought by General Coase were really in reinforcements, but took them to be a ruse by means of which we were trying to make our troops appear larger by causing a detachment sent out the night before to march back to camp. If, then, everything was favorable, if everything had been foreseen, and the operation well conducted, what was the cause of the fateful defeat of San Jacinto? It was the excessive number of raw recruits in the 500 men under the command of General Coase. As is well known, such recruits contribute little in sustaining a battle, but cause the very grave evil of introducing disorder with their irregular operations among tried veterans, especially in a surprise. A cargo of supplies I had ordered not to be brought, and the guarding of which reduced the 500 men that I had asked for to a bare 100 was also a cause. The capture of an order that was sent to me from Thompson's, as well as that of the officer bringing it, was likewise a cause. The fatigue and lack of food of the 500 men of General Coase's and of my escort, an imperious necessity that made me allow them time for their rations, was no less a crime. The disdain with which a constantly fleeing enemy was generally viewed by our troops, well deserved up to this time, though carried to an extreme, was another cause. The very inaccessibility of the ground we occupied was itself a cause, for without a close vigilance, such as I had emphatically ordered, it permitted the enemy to occupy successfully the woods to the right, as it did in an act of desperation. None of these causes was the result of neglect on my part, or the acts immediately emanating from me. I, therefore, can only be held responsible for having a sickly and weak body, on account of which, after having spent the previous day marching, the night watching, and the entire morning on horseback, I yielded to a repose that unfortunately the time allowed the troops brought up by General Coase's made possible, and which in moments of greater danger, however, I would not have indulged in. As General-in-Chief, I fulfilled my duty by issuing the necessary orders for the vigilance of our camp. As a man, I succumbed to an imperious necessity of nature, for which I do not believe that a charge can be justly brought against any general, much less if such a rest is taken at the middle of the day, under a tree, and in the very camp itself. This proves also that I did not abandon myself immoderately to the comforts and pleasant well-being that our human condition requires, a failing which the greatest men of our age, including the military men of our century, have not been able to escape without being accused of carelessness or lack of foresight. It was fate, therefore, and fate alone, that dipped the wings of victory that was about to crown our efforts. Though I do not flatter myself that my operations are above reproach, in spite of what has been briefly stated, I do not believe that persons of judgment and sane criteria and thinking military men who are free from bias will fail to admit how unfounded have been the charges by which it has been attempted to represent me before the world as a conceited and overproud general without knowledge, without a plan, without foresight, without caution, and, in a word, without any of those qualities that adorn a military leader of my kind, who in other campaigns has known how to be victorious, but whose name, now that misfortune has placed his very life in jeopardy, is dishonored, while the nation that confided its defense to him is accused of having exercised little judgment, at least in so doing. We were overcome at San Jacinto, and I was taken before the chief of the Texans, Houston, on the 22nd. I endured untold sufferings of all kinds, but as I have had the sorrow of learning, only by ending my life could they have placed me beyond the recriminations of my fellow citizens. He also wrote, "The conduct of General Castrillon and of other officers to whom the vigilance of our camp in full view of the enemy was entrusted contributed considerably to the already mentioned misfortune. I regret to have to discuss an individual who is dead, one whom I always regarded with esteem. Likewise, I regret to have to speak of others who are still living, but duty obliges me to relate the facts as they were. I have positive evidence to prove that all the time I was sleeping, the said general occupied himself with making his toilet and changing his clothes, and that when the enemy attacked and surprised our advance guards, he was whiling away his time in a party with the other officers of my staff. He did not inspect our outposts a single time, and his example was followed by the other officers. Thus part of the troops were sleeping, while those who were awake, not being vigilant, permitted the enemy to carry out a surprise that could not have been more complete had it taken place in the middle of the night. As a result, it was easy for the enemy to take possession of the woods on our right with only 116 men, in spite of being defended by 3 chosen companies. Though they outnumbered the enemy, they offered no resistance. This was the source of the encouragement that enabled the enemy to continue the charge, as well as the cause of the confusion in our camp, increased by the panic that possessed the recruits, who, unable to use their arms, permitted the enemy to assassinate them in cold blood. It is true that General Castrillon conducted himself with extraordinary bravery, as I have stated, during the last moments of the engagement, but his efforts then were useless, and before he breathed his last, his remorse must have been great if he paused to think how he neglected his duty at a time when he should have attended to it. A few lines later, Santa Anna added, "The force under my command was superior to the quality of that of the enemy. It was well supplied with food and munitions, and it held an advantageous position. That of the enemy was inferior in number. It was cut off by Buffalo Bayou in the San Jacinto and occupied a disadvantageous position. The enemy was without food. An attempt to draw it into battle had been made on the previous day before the arrival of our reinforcement, but the challenge had been refused. Who, under such conditions, would have wanted to mobilize a whole army, losing precious moments in the meantime? Who could have doubted victory? I appeal to the impartial judgment of the intelligent classes, feeling confident that, far from siding with envy and malice and imputing carelessness, precipitation, and lack of foresight on my part, they will admit that judgment, foresight, and discretion were exercised in considering the circumstances, and that if these did not result in victory as it was expected, it was through no lack of plan, nor failure of coordination in the operations, nor the dispositions of the general-in-chief. Having demonstrated, as I have done, that the catastrophe of San Jacinto was caused purely by the faults and carelessness of some of my subordinates and the disregard of orders by others, there remains nothing for me but to deplore my participation in the engagement. My regrets are mitigated, however, when I remember that I did everything that was in my power, exceeding the duties of a general-in-chief, to serve my country well. I find no other excess in my conduct than my zeal for the interests of the country, placing them above my own, and subordinating everything else to the desire to defend them well and to cover with glory the arms entrusted to me. Fortune turned its back upon me at the very moment when my efforts were to be crowned with success, preventing me from having the satisfaction of presenting a new laurel to the nation and leaving my desire unknown." Jose Enrique de la Pena had a different perspective than His Excellency Santa Anna. De la Pena wrote, "Among the victims immolated by the criminal and unforgivable carelessness that has been occupying our attention, we find General Manuel Fernandez Castrillon, who perished while bravely trying to restore order in our ranks. Colonel Don Jose Batres, our aide to the commander-in-chief, who was overtaken in flight and cut down without offering any resistance. The courageous Lieutenant Colonel Esteban Mora, and the amiable Don Marcial Peralta Aguirre of the same rank, and many other meritorious officers, among them Don Santiago Luelmo, Don Nestor Guzman Larumbe, Vallejo Roca, and others whom I do not recall at the moment. Among the 730 prisoners whose lives were spared perhaps to suffer greater tortures than death itself, were 50 leaders and officers, including the commander-in-chief, his secretary, and his chaplain, whose names are found in the accompanying narrative. De La Pena continued and said, Houston has purposely withheld from his dispatch the circumstance to which he owed his victory in order not to diminish the renown it has bestowed on him. For certainly, without such a complete surprise, the more reprehensible because it was at midday, he never could have obtained it. General Santa Anna had under his command forces superior in both number and discipline. He had excellent officers, and though there were some recruits in his ranks, these were the lesser number. Of choice companies he had 10, and among the fusiliers of the other contingents there were veteran soldiers who on more than one occasion had decked their foreheads with the laurels of victory. Houston, on the contrary, had forces inferior in number which, though composed of men with courage, were not subject to the discipline that makes the soldier. They did not follow any specific tactics, nor had they mastered fundamentals of war. It can be said of them that they were recruits, courageous men, who tried only to save or sell their lives dearly, for which reason the defeat at San Jacinto appears the more humiliating. For in defeat, disgrace is quite possible, just as one can be vanquished without necessarily losing honor. But on the 21st April, everything was lost. Men, arms, and reputation, end quote from De La Pena. The battle had indeed lasted officially only 18 minutes. 18 minutes for victory. Then came the time for death, and the angel of death pushed the soldiers of Texas on, and the carnage and slaughter went on and on and on as they chased down the fleeing Mexican soldiers. Musket balls pierced the skulls of those that fled into Peggy's Lake. Surrendering soldiers were bludgeoned to death. So it goes. I don't presume to sit in judgment on the acts of the dead. What happened on that field of battle happened, and nothing can change it. In Homer's Iliad, Achilles says, "We men are wretched things." And whether justified by rage and the desire for vengeance or not, wretched things were done once the Mexican encampment had been taken in 18 minutes, a mirror to the wretched things performed at the Alamo and Goliad. Laureled with victory on that day, who's to say that the events did not cause nightmares for some time to come? Just as the veterans celebrated their heroic acts, or perhaps some just as well might have slept peacefully and with bliss in their later years. Before moving on, I want to dive deeper into a number of personal recollections that were recorded in the years after the events. And if you've noticed any differences in the account that I just shared of the Battle of San Jacinto, it's because there are lots of different accounts that were given afterwards. Some of them were more favorable to Houston. Some were not favorable at all to Houston. And that's because, in large part, that Texas politics became an issue of personality after the Republic was founded. And the formation of the story of Texas history was in its infancy then. The birth of the myth and mystique of Texas started then, into shaping it into what we have had for several decades now. And I did my best to try to go through as many different accounts, textbooks, books about San Jacinto, references of all kinds of different sorts, to try to see what was the most common account that made sense with each other. And in the future, I'm going to be digging through deeper and deeper into more personal accounts and different accounts of the Battle of San Jacinto and refining this to something a little bit more comprehensive and complete. And so before moving on, I want to focus more on some actual firsthand accounts that have been saved and recorded over the years. And they're quite fascinating. They don't all agree with each other, but where they do, you can build a basis for which there's some consistency in the narrative and what happened. Depending on where you were on the battlefield, you couldn't see everything that was happening. So it's interesting to see the accounts of people from different places in the battle. And so let's begin with James Monroe Hill. Now, Hill was one of Burleson's men, and he provides quite a bit of detail. So in the quote from him, he starts, "At about 3:00 in the afternoon of the 21st, the order was given to fall in line. We were going to fight now. The order was hardly given sooner than obeyed, for we kept ready all the time. We had nothing else to do, and we did that with a will. Each company took its place in the line, and we marched through the north end of the island of timber. Houston passed by me riding a gray dapple horse, his big saber swinging by the buckskin strings to his belt. And I thought him the finest looking man I had ever seen, or ever yet have seen. I thought it probable that either he or his horse would be shot. A noted mark for the enemy, had all confidence in his bravery." And then later, Hill added, "As I passed down the flatlands, I saw General Houston on a different horse. I afterward heard that it was a third one, 2 having been killed under him. I did not know then that he himself was wounded." Lyman Frank Rounds, a member of the Army of San Jacinto, also later wrote his thoughts of the attack. And he said, "We lay here until about 4:00 p.m., 21st of April, when we formed to make the attack. Now, although an admirer of General Houston, I think he made a rather unmilitary movement in making the attack. We formed in double file, marched at a right angle on the enemy's left until within musket range, filed to right by flank, so that our Company A had to march the entire length of the Mexican line under fire before we could face to the front and return their fire. But nevertheless, in 20 minutes, we had them on the run, and before sundown, we stretched 800 of them on the field, never to rise again on the 22nd. And that corresponds with an earlier account of somebody saying how they had marched out and then marched across the field. And so instead of apparently marching straight across, they actually tried to stay under cover as long as possible and then crossed across the field and spread out the line. Moses Austin Bryan, who was related to Stephen F. Austin, wrote of Houston's wounding. He wrote, "Soon after the general ordered Captain Turner's men back to the Mexican camp and is about to return himself, being shot through the ankle, when a Mexican officer's horse, upon which he had been mounted after losing the gray upon which he went into battle, fell with the general and expired in a few minutes. Some men standing by, catching the general as he fell. I, with others, looked at the horse and found he was shot through with a ball. The general mounted again and left for the Mexican camp, which was the last I saw of him that evening." James Washington Winters, who is also part of Sherman's group, described the action. "I saw Houston in the midst of the enemy's tents near the 1st Regiment to the right. A Mexican officer tried to rally his men, but was soon dispatched by a rifle ball and fell from his horse. Our regiment passed beyond the Mexican breastwork before we knew it, while our other 2 regiments came up in front of them. So then we did them up in short order. I never heard any halt order. We never halted. The battle was won in 15 or 18 minutes. The Mexican cavalry broke in disorder, while ours was hotly pursuing them. Houston had 2 horses killed from under him and was on his 3rd one before we passed the Mexican works." Alfonso Steele described his part of the combat. "We advanced in the following order: Houston with artillery in the center, the cavalry on the right, and Sherman on the left. The Mexicans had thrown up breastworks out of their baggage about 100 yards south of a point of timber where they had stationed their artillery. Santa Anna's right wing was placed in a thick grove of timber. When we got pretty close, General Houston sent word to Colonel Sherman to attack this position. We were ordered to move forward and hold our fire until orders were given. When we got up within 60 or 70 yards, we were ordered to fire. Then all discipline, so far as Sherman's regiment was concerned, was at an end. We were all firing as rapidly as we could, and as soon as we fired, every man went to reloading. And he who first got his gun reloaded moved on, not waiting for orders. I got my gun loaded and rushed on into the timber and fired again. When the second volley was poured into them in that timber, they broke and ran. As soon as I got my gun loaded again, I ran on a little in front of our men and threw up my gun to shoot when I was shot down. Dave Rusk was standing by me when I was shot. He told some of the men to stay with me, but I told him, no, take them on. One of our men in passing asked me if he could take my pistol, but by this time I was bleeding at the nose and mouth, so I couldn't speak. So he just stooped down and got it and went on. After laying there a while, I managed to get to a sitting position and drink some water I had in a gourd. This stopped the blood from coming from my nose and mouth. While I was sitting thus, one of our men who had been lying behind came along and asked me if I was wounded. I told him I was, and he said, I will stay with you then. I told him, all right, please go and bring me a gourd of water. While he was gone after the water, I got up to see if I could walk. I had lost so much blood. When I had walked 5 or 6 steps, I got blind and couldn't see. I sat down by a little sapling. After sitting there a few minutes, I could see again. About this time, the fellow got back with a gourd of water. Just as he went to hand me the water, a couple of Mexicans came running towards us. I suppose they had hid in the grass until our men had passed and were now running back to get out of the way. When they got in about 20 steps of us, they saw us and threw up their hands and began to jabber something. I said to the fellow with me, shoot one of them Mexicans. He said, I can't do it. They want to surrender. I said, I don't want any more prisoners. Hand me my gun and I will shot one of them. He handed me my gun, which was lying where I had fallen, and I shot one of them down. The other ran off. The fellow said, it won't do for us to stay here in this timber. I said, well, you can go. I can't. I will go and get you a horse and carry you out, he said. He went and got a horse and carried me out and put me among a lot of dead Mexicans. I was so blind I could hardly see anything, and I sat down on a dead Mexican. While I was sitting there, some of our regulars who had stayed at the Mexican breastworks and were sticking their bayonets through the wounded Mexicans came along, and one of them had his bayonet drawn to stick through me, when General Tom Green, who belonged to the artillery corps, stopped him. Then I was put on a horse and started toward our camp. No one went with me, but the horse carried me in all right. That night I was carried across the bayou to De Zavala's residence, which he had given up as a hospital. Another early recorder of the events that's anonymous, unfortunately. I haven't been able to figure out who it was that wrote it, but it's in the official records. He wrote, volunteers armed with muskets and bayonets, and the residue were armed with rifles and belt pistols. The Mexicans were encamped on a high prairie, with their right resting in a cedar thicket upon the border of a lake connected with the San Jacinto River. The division of coast was about 150 yards in the rear of their front line, resting in careless security after their forced march. Benjamin McCullough recalled the events as follows. At the Battle of San Jacinto, I was in command of one piece of artillery. The fire from it opened upon the enemy about 200 yards distant. We advanced after each discharge, keeping in advance of the infantry until we were within less than 100 yards of their breastwork, at which time I had aimed the gun, but was delayed in firing for a moment by General Houston, who passed across some 30 yards in front of the gun, and was at that time nearly that distance in advance of every man in that part of the field. After this, I saw him advancing upon the enemy, at least 1/3 of the distance between the two armies, in front of Colonel Burleson's regiment, when it was not more than 70 or 80 yards from the enemy's breastworks. About this time, the enemy gave way and the rout became general. Walter Lane, who had been injured the previous day, participated in the combat and had this memory. General Houston wanted to wait a few days for reinforcements. He told them that he had couriers from several companies all hurrying on that would be there in 2 days. He was right, but the men sent up their officers demanding fight. So fight it was. We marched out about 4 o'clock in the afternoon to attack the enemy, to the tune by drum and fife of the girl I left behind me. You see, there's a difference in what song it was. When we got in half a mile of them, the artillery and infantry opened on us. But as we were going up a slight ascent, they overshot us. We never fired a gun until we got within 40 yards. The order rang out, halt, fire, and charge. We did. In a second, we were into them with guns, pistols, and bowie knives, and there arose the cry of, remember the Alamo. In a short time, they were running like turkeys, whipped and discomfited. As we charged into them, the general commanding the Tampico battalion, their best troops, tried to rally his men, but could not. He drew himself up, faced us, and had said in Spanish, "I have been in 40 battles and never showed my back. I am too old to do it now." General Rusk hallooed to his men, "Don't shoot him," and knocked up some of their guns, but others ran around and riddled him with balls. I was sorry for him. He was an old Castilian gentleman, General Castrillo, meaning General Castrillon. As we charged through their camp, I heard a row in a hospital tent. It was a countryman of mine. A wounded officer was lying on a cot and 4 or 5 soldiers under it hiding, and my countryman exclaiming to them, "Bring out the chist, or by Jesus, I'll blow ye brains out." It was a medicine chest. He thought it was the army treasury. I told him of his mistake and got him out. We chased the enemy to the lake. They took to water like ducks to swim across, our men firing at their heads. They had gone some 50 yards when someone cried for us to stop firing. We did so. He hailed the Mexicans in Spanish and told them to come back, and we would not hurt them. They returned, and as they neared the shore, he said, "Now, boys, give it to them," which they did, killing some 200. I never fired a shot. Scion Record Bostick, who had joined up with Mosley Baker's command, had this recollection of the events. The next day in the evening, Houston ordered us to attack the Mexicans. Sherman on the left commenced the fight. We were all on foot except a small cavalry force under Lamar. We moved down a slope slowly, but when we started up a long sloping ridge, the Mexican breastworks were on the top of it, we all went in double quick. Every one of us was yelling, "Remember the Alamo, remember Fannin." In a little while, the Mexicans broke and ran. Just back of there was low marshy land and a kind of lake. Many of them tried to cross, but they bogged down, and we shot them. A few got through, and we captured them the next day. Joseph Lawrence shared this memory. As we closed in and began the work of the 2 small cannons, the twin sisters on them, they retreated in disorder toward the bridge. We followed the cavalry. For the first 6 miles, they ran very even and kept out of reach, but after that, we gained on them and shot our carbines at them, dropping them off their horses. We then used our holster pistols and long knives. There was not one of our 80 men that did not get one or more of the Mexicans. At the end of 12 miles, we all stopped to rest and let our horses rest. When we dismounted, we were so fatigued we could not stand up and fell around like a company of drunken men. M. H. Denham shared this memory of the battle. On the morning of the 21st, they were reinforced by General Coase with near 600 men, thus making their force nearly double ours. The crisis was now approaching. The battleground was something in the shape of a horseshoe, and if we delayed in attacking them, other reinforcements were on their march to join them, and if they attacked us and we were defeated, there was no possible chance of us to retreat. We had a chance of defeating them, although so much superior to us in everything, they being Santa Anna's choice troops. It was therefore determined to attack them without delay. About 3 o'clock in the evening of the 21st, we formed in 3 columns and advanced to the attack. We moved on rapidly until within 150 yards of their lines over a prairie. They were in the woods. When we deployed into line and charged up to their works, they kept up a very severe fire on us for about 20 minutes, when their whole line gave way, and a scene of slaughter took place which defied description. We knew what would be our fate if we were defeated, for Santa Anna had sworn to save no lives, and our men in retaliation had sworn the same. They were pursued until dark, and that alone put an end to the carnage. The cry of the Alamo, La Bahia was heard above the roaring of the cannons and the crack of the rifles. The ground was strewed with them for miles. Their famous lancers were pursued 5 miles and entirely cut to pieces. Of about 100 who attempted to cross the river, all but 9 were killed or drowned. Their whole army was annihilated. Out of the 1,200, but 9 escaped. Near 600 were killed on the field, and the rest wounded and taken prisoners. Another contemporary account written days after the event stated, "Never did men engage in battle with a firmer determination to conquer or die. They had nothing to hope of mercy from the perfidious and cruel enemy. They had no hope of life but in victory." George Erath, who I've mentioned a couple of times, remembered the battle as follows. "Descending into a sink of ground, then reaching a small eminence 200 or 300 yards from the Mexicans, we were ordered to wheel by left into front, which was done and brought us to the top of the hill. Coming from the front, General Houston came dashing through our lines. The Mexican bullets were flying. The 2nd Regiment on our left had already joined combat. General Houston cried, 'Not a man reinforcement, not a man reinforcement,' and galloping on was wounded soon after. I have said we knew of the reinforcement. I knew it, and the whole of the company to which I belonged knew it well. By going up the hill to the thicket where the council mentioned took place, we could almost count the Mexicans. They could also be seen by climbing trees. At about 11 o'clock that morning, a man stationed in a tree was telling those below what he saw, when a load of grape shot went through the treetops and he slipped down in a hurry. I had heard a confidential conversation between General Rusk and Colonel Burleson in which Rusk said the idea must be put out that Santa Anna had gone, and that the men coming into the camp at daylight were the escort returning which had guarded him out. The disposition we were in at that time to fight and in the suspense was not affected by that cry of "not a man reinforcement." The idea flashed to me at the moment that under the fire of their Mexican artillery and in the excitement of the opening battle, it was an insult to us to think we could care for that little reinforcement. We would have fought the whole world then. We had been marched from the Guadalupe in a roundabout, zigzag way through swamps and bogs. We had lived part of the time on half-spoiled beef. We had been delayed in going through the lower country, often standing knee-deep in water, waiting on baggage wagons to be drawn out of bogs. We had the experience of having even a woman draw a gun on us, some of us, for confiscating her oxen under orders, and we had been subjected to all the military discipline and practices that were ever enforced on troops of any country, standing guard 24 hours out of 48, and not allowed to go to sleep even at the guard fire. General Houston made us of speech at Harrisburg as we started on our march to attack the Mexicans. He promised us that we should have full satisfaction for all we had gone through, and he closed his address by saying, "Let your war cry be, remember the Alamo." And Erath continued, "As the Mexicans shot high, nearly all the harm done to us was done during the descent of the hill to the Mexican line. We reserved our fire. It seemed to me that the order to fire as premature, as we were 150 yards, I thought, from the Mexicans. While reloading my gun after my first fire, I choked the ball. A young man named Ed Blakely was mortally wounded higher up the hill. He ran along by my side until he fell. I picked up his gun and shot bag and threw mine down. The whole Mexican line was in full flight by the time I got a second shot. Our men advanced rather in disorder and drove the Mexicans across the boggy slough where many fell. Their cannon had been taken and passed. Ours had ceased firing because we were too closely mixed with the Mexicans. At a point of timber across the slough, which was by this time bridged with bogged horses on which we crossed, a Mexican officer of high rank, flourishing his sword, made a grand appeal to rally his men, but was shot down. And the men who had turned to face us again resumed their flight, only to be overtaken and shot. I do not like to dwell on these scenes. No doubt our men were justifiable, as the Mexican nation deserved punishment for its perfidy, though the soldiers were not responsible for it. About half of them were killed, some drowned in the bay. General Almonte, with commendable daring, came forward among our men, called for officers, and demanded to be allowed to surrender. About 500 men grouped up behind him on the principle of civilized warfare. I did not see this. I believe Colonel Burleson was the officer who accepted the surrender and gave the orders to cease firing. At the time, I was with a large party of men, all from different commands, who were pursuing Mexicans toward the bay. Some attempted to swim across. I returned then. Our troops were scattered and as much in disorder as the Mexicans. It took me some time to find the regiment or the nucleus with the colonel in it, about the center of the Mexicans. The drums were beating the assembly and men were slowly coming in. And Rusk summarized the battle with the following words. And this was from his report to Burnett. Early next morning, about 9 o'clock, the enemy received a reinforcement of 500 men under the command of General Martin Perfect de Cos, which increased their strength to 1,400 or 1,500 men. It was supposed that an attack upon our encampment would now be made, and having a good position, we stationed our artillery and disposed of the forces so as to receive the enemy to the best advantage. At 3 o'clock, however, the foe, instead of showing signs of attack, was evidently engaged in fortifying. We determined, therefore, immediately to assail him, and in half an hour we were formed in 4 divisions. The first intended as our right wing, composed of the regulars under Colonel Millard, and the second division under command of Colonel Sidney Sherman formed our left wing. A division commanded by Colonel Burleson formed our center. Our 2 6-pounders under command of Colonel Hockley, Captain Isaac N. Moreland, and Stillwell were drawn upon the right of the center division. The cavalry, under command of Colonel Mirabal B. Lamar, were formed up on the right. At the command to move forward, all the divisions advanced in good order and high spirits. Upon arriving within reach of the enemy, a heavy fire was opened, first with their artillery on our cavalry. A general conflict now ensued. Orders were given to charge. Colonel Sherman's division moved up and drove the enemy from the timber woods occupied by them on their right wing at the same moment that Colonel Burleson's division, together with the regulars, charged upon and mounted upon the breastwork of the enemy and drove them from their cannon. Our artillery, the meanwhile, charging up and firing upon theirs with great effect. The cavalry under Colonel Lamar fell on them at the same time with great fury and great slaughter. Major General Houston acted with great gallantry, encouraging his men to attack and heroically charge in front of the infantry within a few yards of the enemy, receiving at the same time a wound in his leg. The enemy soon took flight, officers and all, some on foot and some on horseback. In 10 minutes after the firing of the first guns, we were charging through the camps and driving them before us. They who fled in confusion and dismay down the river followed closely by our troops for 4 miles. Some of them took the prairie, and more pursued by our cavalry. Others were shot in attempting to swim the river, and in a short period the sanguinary conflict was terminated by the surrender of nearly all who were not slain in the combat. 1/2 of their army perished, the other half are prisoners. Another early account said the enemy fired their cannons 5 times only. It was loaded the 6th time and primed. The man who held the match was killed by a boy and the piece taken. It is a splendid brass 9-pounder bearing the inscriptions El Volcan and Violati Fulmina Regis in Roman capital letters. The cannon was taken and the enemy put to rout. Of the whole right wing of the enemy, 1 man only escaped death. They were slaughtered and finally driven into the water, and the rifles ceased not their crack, while an object appeared above the surface of it. The left wing of the enemy fled in confused order, commanded by Colonel Almonte, and laid down their arms and surrendered to a small body of cavalry 2 miles from the battlefield. And this was the surrender that was talked about before. And some say that Seguin and his Tejano soldiers were involved in the surrender of Almonte. James Washington Winters recollected the following. After dinner, the men were ready for battle. I was in Sherman's division, left wing of attack, but under my own captain, William Ware. Rush started out with us, but turned and went to the artillery. When we ran over the ridge, we lost sight of the rest. On beginning the battle, before we got in sight of the Mexicans, they began firing at us. They were lying down in the grass. We examined the place where many had been and found as many as 5 ends of cartridges where each man lay. So suppose that each man had fired at us as many as 5 times before we reached them. Their breastworks were composed of baggage, saddlebags, and brush, in all about 4 or 5 feet high. There was a gap 8 or 10 feet wide through which they fired the cannon. I saw Houston in the midst of the enemy's tents near the 1st Regiment to the right. A Mexican officer tried to rally his men, but was soon dispatched by a rifle ball and fell from his horse. Our regiment passed beyond the Mexicans' breastwork before we knew it, while our other 2 regiments came up in front of them. So then we did them up in short order. I never heard any halt ordered. We never halted. The battle was won in 15 or 18 minutes. The Mexican cavalry broke in disorder while ours was hotly pursuing them. Houston had 2 horses killed from under him and was on his 3rd one before he passed the Mexican works. We ran and fought fully 2 miles. The day after the battle, James Tarleton wrote this very fresh account to his brothers. At last, at 3:30 p.m., we were ordered to prepare for battle, which was soon done, and then commenced a conflict, the parallel of which I presume cannot be found on record. To see a mere handful of raw, undisciplined volunteers just taken from their plows and thrown together with rifles without bayonets, no 2 perhaps of the same caliber, and circled only by 2 pieces of artillery, 6-pounders, and a few musketeers, some with and some without bayonets, and some 40 or 50 men on horseback to meet the trained bands of the hero of so many victories, to see them with trailed arms marching to within some 60 or 70 yards of such an army, at least doubled in number, entrenched 2 behind a breastwork impregnable to small arms, and protected by a long brass 9-pounder, to see them, I say, do all this fearless and determined to save their country and their country's liberty or to die in the effort, was no ordinary occurrence. Yet such was their conduct, and so irresistible was that Spartan phalanx, that it was not more than from 15 to 20 minutes from our first fire until a complete rout of the enemy was effected. And such slaughter on the one side and such almost miraculous preservation on the other have never been heard of since the invention of gunpowder. The commencement of the attack was accompanied by the watchwords, "Remember the Alamo, Laborde, and Tampico," at the very top of our voices. And in some 10 minutes, we were in the full possession of the enemy's encampment, cannon, all things else, whilst his veterans were in the greatest possible disorder, attempting by flight to save their lives. I happened to be so placed in the regiment to which I was attached that I was enabled to be the 3rd men who entered the entrenchment, which I soon left in company with the balance of the regiment in pursuit of the defeated enemies of the Texian liberty. I feel confident that I do not exaggerate when I state their loss in killed as nearly, if not quite equal to the whole of our number engaged, whilst we had only 6 killed on the spot and some 12 or 15 wounded, 2 of whom have died since. One of them, Dr. Motley of Kentucky, a relative of Mr. Shapley Owen, who died tonight, and since I commenced writing this letter. The number of our prisoners has not yet been officially announced, but I should suppose it to be nearly, if not quite 600, many of whom are wounded. So complete has been our triumph and their defeat that my antipathy to them has subsided, and I can now commiserate their condition. Now, there's an anonymous account by a Mexican officer that's in existence, and it reads, "Seeing that the president had no alternative, we began to beat our retreat with a few cavalry, having been chased by the enemy more than 4 leagues until we reached a creek 12 varas wide and very deep. There had been a wooden bridge at that passage, but the enemy had ordered that it be set afire that morning after General Cosa's division had crossed it. We had not received news of the destruction of the mentioned bridge. When we reached it, we had no recourse but to jump into the water with our horses, as we had no time with the enemy upon us. Santa Anna was undecided about what he would do, but I and Senor Cos jumped into the water. It was impossible, however, for the horses to climb the opposite side because of a large, thick wall that was there. We abandoned them to go out on foot, but since there were enemies on the opposite bank, most that crossed were killed or captured. I had the good luck to escape through the brush. I walked 4 days on foot through very thick brushwood by nights, as I could not take the road. Needing to cross the Brazos River myself, and another soldier that accompanied me accomplished this by constructing a poor wooden raft that we strapped together with our sashes. We managed to arrive on the 25th at the camp of Philisola, who prohibited me from writing to W the details of this disgrace. Other things happened that I must not trust to the pen. I arrived at this port of Matamoros, where I am writing now. I have recuperated and feel better. And this is thought to have been from a letter written home, and it was found as part of a pamphlet called The Imprint of the Testimony of Valdez, and it's in the University of Texas Archives and shared by the Sons of DeWitt Colony.org. And another interesting compilation, and this is not from the official report. This is from Henry Foote's Texas and Texans, Volume 2, that was published in 1841, and it recounts some of the memories of General Thomas Rusk. And according to Rusk, when the 1st Regiment and the regulars had advanced within about 100 yards of the breastwork of the enemy, a charge was made by a division of the Mexicans under the command of Colonel Cespedes, I think, on our artillery, which was at this time a little in advance. Mexican cannon, which had been previously directed toward our cavalry, was now ordered to make way for the charging party upon our artillery, and was pointed in the direction of the 1st Regiment. An attempt was made to fire it, but the man who held the match was shot down by our soldiers. The 1st Regiment, at that instant, with the most deafening yell I ever heard, charged upon the breastwork. Our cannon fired at the same moment, and the Mexicans at the breastwork and cannon, as well as their charging party, commenced an immediate and disorderly flight. General Castrillon, who was commanding the Mexican artillery, was standing on the ammunition boxes behind the piece, exposed from head to foot. He used every effort to keep his men to the gun. When he found that to be impossible, he folded up his arms, stood and looked sullenly, and without moving, upon our troops, who were advancing upon him, until they arrived at or near the breastwork. He was 50 yards in the rear of his retreating men when he turned round deliberately and walked slowly off. He had proceeded some 30 or 40 steps when he was shot and fell. I examined him after the battle and found that several rifle balls had passed directly through his body. Castrillon was a Gauchapin, or European Spaniard, was said to be quite a gentlemanly, honorable man, and was a general of artillery. And Rusk also said that at the close of the fight, and just after sundown, Colonel Almonte came out of the woods and surrendered with about 250 men. There were, at that place, not exceeding 10 or 15 Americans, and none of them could speak the Mexican language well. The prisoners were standing in a body, and they were asked in the Spanish language if any of them could speak English. Almonte answered in Spanish that they could not. They were then told in Spanish to form 2 and 2 deep and march with us to camp. They formed and commenced marching accordingly. Our few men were distributed around them as a guard. Most of us were very much fatigued, and such was the condition of the Mexicans also. As we proceeded along in this way, one of our men, who was so much tired that he could scarcely walk, being accommodated by a Mexican who was walking immediately before him and who had dropped out of the line of the prisoners, observed to the intruder in English, "God damn you, if you don't get back in line, I'll with my bayonet." A word is missing there. This conversation occurred near Almonte, who immediately told the prisoner who had been thus addressed what had been said to him. I concluded that he at least must understand English very well, and that it was probably Almonte whom I saw before me. I therefore observed to him, "You must be Colonel Almonte." He replied in English, "You speak very well." I then rode up to him and gave him my hand, saying to him, "It affords me great pleasure to see you, Colonel." With great presence of mind and with his customary politeness, he responded, "The pleasure is reciprocal." During the fight, a Mexican officer found himself at the very muzzle of a rifle in the hands of one of our men. He begged for mercy, and happened at that moment to see a Mexican who was in our ranks, whose name was Menchaca, whom he had known for many years, at Bear. He bellowed out to Menchaca, calling him a brother Mexican, and invoked him to save his life. Menchaca replied, "No, damn you, I'm no Mexican, I'm an American, shoot him." And the soldier fired and killed him. Whilst the battle was in progress, the celebrated deafsmith, although on horseback, was with the infantry. When they got pretty near the enemy, Smith galloped on ahead and dashed directly up to the Mexican line. Just as he reached it, his horse stumbled and fell, throwing him over his head and among the enemy. Having dropped his sword in the fall, he jumped up, drew one of his belt pistols, presented it at the head of a Mexican who was attempting to bayonet him, and the percussion cap exploded without the pistol going off, upon which Smith threw the pistol at the head of the Mexican, staggered him back, seized his gun, took it from him, and defended him with it until the infantry got up to his relief. And continuing on, this account says, a young man by the name of Robbins during the fight dropped his gun, happening to run directly in contact with a Mexican soldier who had also lost his gun. The Mexican seized Robbins, and both being stout men soon fell to the ground. Robbins managed, whilst contending on the earth, to get out a bowie knife, which he had in his belt, and quickly ended the contest by cutting the Mexican's throat. About the commencement of the battle, Dr. Motley, a gentleman from Kentucky, and myself were proximate to each other, near a corner of the enemy's breastwork. I saw Motley fall and asked him if he was hurt. He replied, "Yes, I believe I am mortally wounded." I observed, "Doctor, I will get someone to take care of you." He responded, "No. If you whip them, send back a man to assist me. But if you do not, I shall need no assistance." He died the next day, perfectly resigned to his fate. And now there's another interesting story that shows some of the anger that some of the soldiers did have. And it says, on starting out from our camp to enter upon the attack, I saw an old gentleman by the name of Curtis carrying 2 guns. I asked him what was his reason for carrying more than 1 gun. He answered, "Damn the Mexicans that killed my son-in-law in the Alamo, and I intend to kill 2 of them for it, or be killed myself." I saw the old man again during the fight, and he told me he had killed his 2 men, and if he could find Santa Anna, he would cut a razor strop out of his back. When the Mexicans were first driven from the point of woods where we encountered them, their officers tried to rally them, but the men cried, "It's no use, it's no use, there are 1,000 Americans in the woods." When Santa Anna saw Almonte's division running past him, he called to a drummer and ordered him to beat his drum. The drummer held up his hands and told him he was shot. He called out then to a trumpeter near him to sound his horn. The trumpeter replied that he also was shot. Just at that instant, a ball from one of our cannon struck a man who was standing near Santa Anna, taking off one side of his head. Santa Anna then exclaimed, "Damn these Americans, I believe they will shoot us all." These particulars I received from a little boy who was one of our prisoners and said he was standing near Santa Anna at the time. He immediately mounted his horse and commenced his flight. And Houston's summary is as follows. At 3:30 in the evening, I ordered the officers of the Texian army to parade their respective commands, having in the meantime ordered the bridge on the only road communicating with the Brazos, distant 8 miles from our encampment, to be destroyed, thus cutting off all possibility of escape. Our troops paraded with alacrity and spirit and were anxious for the contest. Their conscious disparity in numbers only seemed to increase their confidence and heighten their anxiety for the conflict. Our situation afforded us an opportunity of making the arrangements preparatory to the attack without exposing our designs to the enemy. And then he goes through the order of battle. 1st Regiment with Burleson side to the center. 2nd Regiment under the command Colonel Sherman formed the left wing of the army. The artillery under the special command of George W. Hockley, who was Inspector General, was placed on the right of the 1st Regiment, and 4 companies of infantry under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Henry Millard sustained the artillery upon the right. Our cavalry, 61 in number, commanded by Colonel Mirabeau B. Lamar, whose gallant and daring conduct on the previous day had attracted the admiration of his comrades and called him to that station, placed on our extreme right, completed our line. Our cavalry was first dispatched to the front of the enemy's left for the purpose of attracting their notice, whilst our extensive island of timber afforded us an opportunity of concentrating our forces and displaying from that point agreeable to the previous design of the troops. Every evolution was performed with alacrity, the whole advancing rapidly in line and through an open prairie without any protection whatever for our men. The artillery advanced and took station within 200 yards of the enemy's breastwork and commenced an effective fire with grape and canister. Colonel Sherman, with his regiment, having commenced the action upon our left wing, the whole line at the center and on the right, advancing in double quick time, sung the war cry, "Remember the Alamo," received the enemy's fire, and advanced within point-blank shot before a piece was discharged from our lines. Our line advanced without a halt until they were in possession of the woodland and the enemy's breastwork, the right wing of Burleson's and the left of Millard's taking possession of the breastwork, our artillery having gallantly charged up within 70 yards of the enemy's cannon, where it was taken by our troops. The conflict lasted about 18 minutes from the time of close action until we were in possession of the enemy's encampment, taking one piece of cannon loaded, 4 stand-of colors, all their camp equipage, stores, and baggage. Our cavalry had charged and routed that of the enemy upon the right and given pursuit to the fugitives, which did not cease until they arrived at the bridge, which I have mentioned before. Captain Carnes, always among the foremost in danger, commanding the pursuers. The conflict in the breastwork lasted but a few moments. Many of the troops encountered hand to hand, and not having the advantage of bayonets on our side, our riflemen used their pieces as war clubs, breaking many of them off at the breach. The rout commenced at 4:30, and the pursuit of the main army continued until twilight. A guard was then left in charge of the enemy's encampment, and our army returned with our killed and wounded. And James Washington Winters, to go back to him, he shared this following recollection of the aftermath. He said, "After the fight was ended, Houston gave orders to form in line and march back to camp. But we paid no attention to him, as we were all shaking hands and rejoicing over the victory. Houston gave the orders 3 times, and still the men paid no attention to him. And he turned his horse around and said, 'Men, I can gain victories with you, but damn your manners,' and rode on to camp." Joel Robinson and Sylvester brought in Santa Anna. I was there when he was brought in, was digging the grave to bury our 8 men. They passed by us and halted at our guard lines. The Mexicans' prisoners clapped their hands and gave other signs of joy, shouting, "Santa Anna, Santa Anna." I dropped my tools and followed after them to Houston, who was lying on his cot at the camp near the bayou. Santa Anna introduced himself, and they began to talk. I do not know who captured Cos, but he was the most frightened man I ever saw. He covered his head with a blanket. I could see it tremble 20 feet off. The greatest slaughter in the battle occurred between the breastworks and the lake. Here the Mexicans and horses killed made a bridge across the bayou. And Washington continued and said, "General Wharton tried to get us to cease and grabbed a Mexican and pulled him up behind him on his horse, saying that was his Mexican. But Jim Curtis shot the Mexican. The Mexican infantry near the lake would jump in occasionally and would dive to get away from our shots, but the minute they would raise their heads, they were picked off by our men. Only a few followed the flying Mexicans to Vince's Bayou. The Mexicans, finding the bridge burned, tried to cross, but their horses bogged. Only one of those trying to cross there got away. All the others were shot. When Santa Anna was brought into camp, some called out, 'Shoot him, hang him.' General Houston ordered the men who made these threats taken away. Next day after the battle, finding that many Mexicans were hidden in the marsh grass, someone set fire to the grass and burned or smoked them out. In this way, about 40 were captured. One who tried to run was shot. The same day, I found a dead Mexican who had silver in his belt, about $10. The money had slipped out when he was shot. Orders were given that all money found be brought into headquarters. I turned this in. Money so captured was distributed to the soldiers, the amount so distributed averaging almost $11 per man. Santa Anna's handsomely ornamented saddle was held up, and the men voted that it should be given to General Houston. Other officers' saddles were sold. One brought as high as $300. I certify that the above statement is correct, or as nearly correct as I can remember. And as I mentioned earlier, Stephen F. Austin's nephew was present, but Stephen F. Austin, of course, was not. And the nephew reported that at one part of the slaughter, an officer ordered some men to stop their butchery. They did not, and he was stood down by a cocked rifle that was reserved for him and his order. They just weren't going to listen to the orders to stop and just take prisoners. Another account, in June 1836, John W. Hassell wrote this letter to his father describing the battle. He said, "We then marched up with 763 men and forced the line of battle within 200 yards of the enemy, when they stood in good order to receive us. We then marched up within good rifle shot, our men and officers pleasant, cool, and brave as lions. Firing then commenced on both sides. Our colonel then ordered Yankee Doodle played," and there's another song said to be played at the battle, "and beat in double quick time, and we were commanded to a charge, and it appeared to me that we were among them in an instant, and it would have done your heart good to have seen them fall. Our cannons, our muskets, our rifles, and pistols played, it appeared to me, the most delightful tune I have ever heard since the world commenced. I had a first-rate rifle, and about this time I was using her, sir, with all my might. She run about 40 to the pound and shot first-rate. I took notice to some of the big yellow bellies, and when Betsy would bore a hole in them, the claret would gush out large as corn stalks. One big fellow, I remember, who I shot in the neck, and it appeared that it had near cut his head off. I shot old Betsy 6 times and a large holster pistol 1 time. In the 7 shots, I know that I killed 4. That thing I know. As I've stated about my pistol, I shot that fellow in the left eyes. Though it may appear strange to you, but not less stranger than true, it seemed to do me more good at that time to throw shot or a bayonet run through them than anything I have ever yet seen, and it appeared to be the prevailing feeling or sentiment. Well, sir, I must tell you that when we got so near with them as to shake hands, they couldn't bear that. They appeared rather bashful at such a meeting as that, and turned their backs to us, and the rest of the way off. About that time we were slaying them like corn stalks. This was an open field fight. We gained complete victory over them in about 16 minutes. We took about 700 prisoners, a large number of which was wounded, a great number of which proved mortal. We took all the officers except 2. 1 lieutenant colonel, 1 captain made their escape. The monster, Santa Anna, who can have men taken out and murdered without a change of countenance or the least remorse of conscience. After making a solemn and sacred treaty, such conduct could not be expected from savage heathen, much less from a nation who pretended to be enlightened, civilized, and Christianized. That was one of the most brutal depictions that I came across. Another is by Isaac Lafayette Hill, who shared an interesting exchange after the battle between Houston and his nemesis, I guess, Mosley Baker. And Hill recorded, "On the afternoon of the 21st, when the army was paraded to attack the Mexicans, Captain Baker harangued his company. He said he wished his men neither to ask or give quarter, as a token of which he proposed that the company carry a red flag. A vote was taken whether we should or should not, but one man, John H. Money, voted against it. A red handkerchief was therefore hoisted for a flag and carried until the battle commenced, when from cause it was thrown away. When the army started back to camp after the battle, it was about dusk. It was halted a moment at the breastworks of the Mexicans, and General Houston addressed it in a few very eloquent sentences, which I long remembered but have now forgotten. After he had concluded, he said to Captain Baker, 'Captain B, have I not done my duty? "Yes, General," replied our captain, "but I wish you had done it sooner." I was not aware that General Houston had been wounded until about the time he began to address the army. Houston's official report stated that the engagement resulted in the deaths of 630 Mexican soldiers, another 208 were wounded, and 730 total were taken prisoner. The Texian army suffered the casualties of 9 dead and 34 wounded, including Houston. 2 men fell during the battle. They, along with 6 others that later died of injuries, were buried where they had camped. Another man lived long enough to be transported to Galveston. I mentioned him, and he was wounded in a skirmish on the 20th, where he finally succumbed to the injuries sustained in combat. Much has been made in the decades after the battle of the fact that the fairly untrained and undisciplined Texian army had defeated a superior, better trained force. And there is some truth in this, but not completely. According to some, the Texians were better armed, had better gunpowder, and they were better trained in the use of their arms. General Filosola made a statement on this point that should be remembered, and he wrote, "If their number was insignificant, the misfortune of San Jacinto proved the contrary, and the number engaged in that battle did not include 1,000 additional men who were scattered at that time in Anahuac, Galveston, Velasco, Culebra Island, and aboard the steamboats. With regard to their discipline and military instruction, I must say that comparisons are always odious. I will content myself with noting that it is only too well known that the kind of people which made up the rebel forces of the Texans lived by their rifles, that is, by hunting, and that a common danger obliged them to practice discipline and cooperation. What instruction did our conscripts recruited on the eve of the expedition have? Had the majority of the recruits that made up our army fired a rifle before in their lives? Consequently, they had less instruction than the enemy in the use of firearms, though the traditional courage and endurance of the Mexican soldier made up for the disparity. With regard to the ability of the officers, there is no doubt that our own were superior. Nevertheless, the enemy forces were well directed. Were it not inadvisable, I would demonstrate by the events of Refugio, Goliad, and El Perdido their skill in unmistakable terms. I can do no less than to suggest to Senor Urrea to study his own operations and those of the enemy a little better before undertaking another campaign, in order that he may be better able to judge the results. Perhaps an event such as that of San Jacinto, which he so bitterly laments now, will not be so incomprehensible to him then. Houston stated in his official report of the battle that he had 783 men under his command at the battle. A later roster he released shared that there were 845 officers and men at San Jacinto, which omitted the soldiers of Captain Alfred H. Wiley's company. That brings the total up to 910. Many years later, while giving a speech in the United States Senate, he claimed that his effective force, never exceeded 700 at any point. So the mysteries of history abound, and there are debates over how many soldiers actually fought. Repeatedly, he said he had 750 to just barely 800, and that's the number that he stuck with that actually participated in the fighting. If you throw in the men that were left behind, sick and wounded and ill, and the ones that were sent to guard, stayed at Harrisburg to guard them, then you have a much greater number. But actually effective soldiers in the battle, who knows exactly how many were there. Now, most accounts all agree that Houston was injured by enemy fire, but I came across one account by a veteran named Ellis Benson, and he claimed that the injury suffered by Houston came as a result of friendly fire. And this is just what he had to say. Mr. Benson claims to have handled one of the guns known as the Twin Sisters and to have cast the shot leaden used in them, which did such damage to the enemy before the grand assault was made on the Mexican lines. Now, in regards to the wound of General Houston, Mr. Benson claimed it was done by his own men for the reason that as he was charging on his horse between the two lines and in front of the Texans, he was shot in the ankle next to the Texans. He says that at the beginning of the charge, fearing that the line would fall into confusion, Houston had hallooed at the top of his voice to the men to halt, but they would not listen, and on they swept upon the enemy. Houston remarked, "I applaud your bravery, but damn your manners." He says it was the men rather than Houston who in reality won the Battle of San Jacinto, and that last sentence would plague Houston for years. He would campaign on the fact that he had led the army to victory, and a lot of people took umbrage at the fact that he got so much credit for something that it was the acts of the body of soldiers as a whole that made the victory happen. Anson Jones, who was a future president of Texas, was present, and he wrote the following memory of the events. And he said, "On the morning of the day we left camp at Harrisburg and crossed the bayou, a general order was issued and a detail was made to stay with the sick, and I and Dr. Phelps, hospital surgeon, were of the number. I resolved, as I have done on subsequent occasions, to disobey the order. I therefore, having attended to my daily routine, handed over my sick to the hospital surgeon and joining the army at the crossing about sundown and proceeded with it to Lynchburg. As a consequence, I participated in the Battle of San Jacinto next day, and on the 21st, and that night was occupied the entire time and until sunrise next morning in assisting to dress the wounds received on the field." Now, to go back to the Mexican accounts of what happened, we can go back and see what Colonel Delgado wrote, and he said that no important incident took place until 4:30 p.m. At this fatal moment, the bugler on the right signaled the enemy's advance upon that wing. His Excellency and staff were asleep. The great number of the men were also sleeping. Of the rest, some were eating, others were scattered in the woods in search of boughs to prepare shelter. Our line was composed of musket stacks. Our cavalry were riding bareback to and from water. I stepped upon some ammunition boxes, the better to observe the movement of the enemy. I saw that their formation was a mere line in one rank and very extended. In their center was the Texas flag. On both wings they had 2 light cannon, well manned. Their cavalry was opposite our front, overlapping our left. In this disposition, yelling furiously with a brisk fire of grape, muskets, and rifles, they advanced resolutely upon our camp. There the utmost confusion prevailed. General Castrillon shouted on one side. On another, Colonel Almonte was giving orders. Some cried out to commence firing, others to lie down to avoid the grape shot. Among the latter was His Excellency. Then already I saw our men flying in small groups, terrified, and sheltering themselves behind large trees. I endeavored to force some of them to fight, but all efforts were in vain. The evil was beyond remedy. They were a bewildered, panic-stricken herd. The enemy kept up a brisk crossfire of grape on the woods. Presently, we heard in close proximity the unpleasant noise of their clamors. Meeting no resistance, they dashed lightning-like upon our deserted camp. Then I saw His Excellency running about in the utmost excitement, wringing his hands and unable to give an order. General Castrillon was stretched upon the ground, wounded in the leg. Colonel Trevito was killed, and Colonel Marcial Aguirre was severely wounded. I saw also the enemy reaching the ordnance train and killing a corporal and 2 gunners who had been detailed to repair cartridges, which had been damaged on the previous evening. Everything was lost. I went, leading my horse, which I could not mount as the firing had rendered him restless and fractious, to join our men, still hoping that we might be able to defend ourselves or to retire under shelter of the night. This, however, could not be done. It is a known fact that Mexican soldiers, once demoralized, cannot be controlled until they are thoroughly inured to war. On the left, and about musket shot distance from our camp, was a small grove on the bay shore. Our disbanded herd rushed for it to obtain shelter from the horrid slaughter carried on all over the prairie by the bloodthirsty usurpers. Unfortunately, we met in our way an obstacle hard to overcome. It was a bayou, not very wide but very deep. The men on reaching it would hopelessly crowd together and were shot down by the enemy, who was close enough to not miss his aim. It was there that the greatest carnage took place. Upon reaching that spot, I saw Colonel Almonte swimming across the bayou with his left hand and holding up his right, which grasped his sword. I stated before that I was leading my horse, but at this critical situation, I vaulted upon him, and with leaps he landed me on the opposite side of the bay. To my sorrow, I had to leave the noble animal mired in that place, and to part with him probably forever. As I dismounted, I sank into the mire, waist deep, and had the greatest trouble to get out of it, catching hold of the grass. Both my shoes remained in the bayou. I made an effort to recover them, but I came to the conclusion that did I tarry there, a rifle shot would make an outlet for my soul, as it happened to many a poor fellow around me. Thus I made for the grove barefooted. There I met a number of other officers with whom I wandered at random, buried in gloomy thoughts upon our tragic disaster. We still entertained a hope of rallying some of the men, but it was impossible. The enemy's cavalry surrounded the grove, while his infantry penetrated it, pursuing us with fierce and bloodthirsty feelings. There they killed Colonel Batres, and it would have been all over with us had not Providence placed us in the hands of that noble and generous captain of cavalry, Allen, who by great exertion saved us repeatedly from being slaughtered by the drunken and infuriated volunteers. Thence they marched us to their camp. I was barefooted. The prairie had recently been burned, and the stubble, hardened by the fire, penetrated like needles the soles of my feet so that I could scarcely walk. This did not prevent them from striking me with the butt end of their guns because I did not walk as fast as they wished. These savages struck me with their bayonets, our wounded soldiers lying on the way. Others following them consummated the sacrifice by a musket or a pistol shot. I cannot forbear the mention of an incident that affected me deeply, and I believe had the same effect on my companions. We were about 150 officers and men picked up by Allen's party, who marched us to their camp under a close guard. I have no doubt that the Americans, amidst the hurrahs and exultation of their camp, were lavish of insults. However, not understanding their language, we did not feel them. But one of our countrymen who had joined the enemy's cause assailed us in our own language with such a volley of threat, insult, and abuse that the tongue of that vile and recreant Mexican seemed to have been wrought in the very caves of hell and set in motion by Lucifer himself. "Now you shall see," he said, "contemptible and faithless assassins, if you do not pay with your vile blood for your murders at the Alamo and La Bahia. The time has come when the just cause that we defend our triumphs over you. You shall pay with your heads for the arson, robberies, and depredations that you have committed in our country," etc., etc. What a welcome to honorable men who knew the depths of their hearts that they had acted in accordance with the dictates of duty, when unfortunate, prostrate, and humble in the extreme, the fate of war had placed their lives in the hands of these brigands, and when they were waiting with resignation the consummation of the sacrifice. Can such wicked men exist? At last we reached the camp. We were seated on the ground by twos, as we had marched. On the shore our thirst had been quenched by an abundance of water, which Allen and others allowed from hand to hand until all were satisfied. A crowd gathered around us, asking with persistent impertinence, "General Santa Anna, General Cos." We knew not the fate of these gentlemen, but to ourselves of their repeated questions we answered, "Dead, dead." I still wore my embroidered shoulder straps on my jacket. They attracted their attention, and one after another would say, "General?" "Me no general," would I answer, until one of the indefatigable questioners tore off my shoulder straps angrily. I was glad of it, as they ceased importuning me with their questions. In the aftermath of the battle and the slaughter, Houston also reported that about 600 muskets, 300 sabers, and 200 pistols have been collected since the action. Several hundred mules and horses were taken, and near $12,000 in specie. So they had captured a few hundred prisoners, hundreds of muskets, hundreds of sabers, a couple of hundred pistols. But the main thing they wanted to capture, they still hadn't. And the number one question still was, where was Santa Anna? And what apparently had happened, as he stood in the middle of the slaughter, an assistant to one of his colonels offered him the colonel's horse, with hopes of escaping and reaching General Filisola's army that was at Thompson's Pass. Santa Anna jumped astride the horse and fled, as recounted earlier, riding past the enemy lines and outrunning the Texas horsemen that pursued. Luckily, somehow he did escape that day. He must have felt dismay when he reached the bridge that he needed to cross and found that Houston had had it burned. The exhausted horse collapsed. The Texans were still pursuing, and Santa Anna, like others, hid in some pine trees. And under the cover of darkness, after the sun set, Santa Anna waded across the cold, chest-deep river and eventually found an abandoned house. In it, he found some dry clothes. He removed his uniform to change, but decided he could not part with his fine linen shirt and sharp-pointed shoes. And he also chose to keep wearing a very distinctive diamond shirt stud. And on the morning of April 22nd, Texian patrols still searched the countryside for Mexican soldiers that had evaded capture up to that point. And one patrol, led by a Kentucky volunteer named James Sylvester, found Santa Anna where he was hiding in the grass. He didn't try to flee. Probably would have been shot if he did. Probably is thinking in his mind. And Stephen Harrigan wrote that Santa Anna displayed an instinctive arrogance when he stood up from the grass and presumed to try to shake Sylvester's hand. Sylvester and the other men in his party asked him, had he seen Santa Anna? And he told them that Santa Anna was farther ahead, and they marched him back to camp. Major John Forbes saw one of the young Texans bringing Santa Anna into camp, and Santa Anna stepped forward and said the words "Sam Houston" a couple of times, motioning to where their wounded general lay beneath a tree with a shattered ankle. And he pulled out a paper, and Forbes looked at it and understood. The salutation read, "Don Lopez de Santa Anna." Santa Anna was then marched to the command tent where Houston lay in pain beneath a large oak tree. The Spanish officers among the prisoners attempted to keep the men quiet when they saw what was happening, but soon the camp was filled with the words "El Presidente, El Presidente." They could be heard everywhere. Forbes remembered that Houston lifted himself up on his elbow to see the prisoner, and Forbes said, and this is a quote, "The prisoner immediately addressed him, telling him who he was and surrendering himself to him, a prisoner of war. General Houston looked at him intensely but made no reply. Houston then sent for interpreters and people to identify Santa Anna, and the exact exchange of words between Houston and Santa Anna was not recorded, but there are some records of it. Houston recalled that Santa Anna stated, "The conqueror of the Napoleon of the West is born to no common destiny, and he can afford to be generous to the vanquished." And Houston claimed to have replied, "You should have remembered that, sir, at the Alamo." Santa Anna claimed that having to storm the Alamo allowed the slaughter, and then added that he was acting on the orders of his government. Houston responded, "You are the government yourself, sir." Now, many of the Texian soldiers crowding around wanted Santa Anna to be executed immediately. But Houston thought it wiser to keep Santa Anna alive, and that decision proved to be one of his best decisions that he made as a commander. Days later, Santa Anna would order the other branches of the Mexican army in Texas to retreat, and he eventually signed 2 treaties. And Santa Anna himself, he never accepted blame for the defeat at San Jacinto or guilt for the bloodshed at the Alamo or Goliad. and he went on to play an important role in the history of Mexico. After the success of the April 21st combat and the subsequent capture of Santa Ana, participants and contemporaries were already contributing to the romantic and glorious history of Texas. This is where the myth and mystique of Texas, the identity of Texas, was starting to be formed from this moment on. Texas history itself goes way back, farther than this event, but this is the period that's been focused on the most, and these events here are a big part of that. The Mexican army had burned the bodies of the Texian dead at the Alamo, which many people considered an offense, and the Texians, some might say, did worse by not doing anything like burn the bodies or attempt to bury them. They just left the Mexican dead out in the elements. One early record that was written on May 1st, 1836 from Galveston by somebody identified only as S in the official records of the Texas Revolution, and they claim to have visited the battlefield, and this person wrote, "The slaughter among the enemy's ranks was tremendous. I took a deliberate look over the field 3 days after the battle. The sight was horrible. Here lying in clusters, there scattered singly. The ground was strewed with dead men, dead horses, guns, bayonets, swords, drums, trumpets, some shattered and broken, books, papers, shoes, sandals, caps. The chaos of a routed army was strewed upon the ground in a confusion which the imagination cannot conceive. The natural eye must behold to be convinced of the reality. The faces of most of the dead were as black as Negroes, horribly swollen and distorted, the tongues protruding, the skin blistered, the limbs in many instances swollen, elevated, and half extended, horrible and disgusting masses of corruption." And this was the scene, if you recall back to the episode on DeLu Rose Harris, this was the scene that little DeLu Rose Harris, age 10, witnessed when she visited the battlefield on the 26th of April, 1836. She would be 11 2 days later, and she stayed on the battlefield for several hours while her father helped with the ferry boat as it transferred people across. She visited the graves of the Texans that were killed at the site of the Texans camp in the grove, and she did not know any of them, but remembered for the rest of her life that the dead Mexicans were lying around in every direction. And then there's Peggy McCormick, who returned to her property to find it filled with Texas soldiers and the bodies of hundreds of Mexican soldiers that had been left where they fell. William Zuber wrote, "After breakfast on the morning of the 23rd, I walked alone to the battlefield. The slain Mexicans were a ghastly sight. Exposed first to a drenching rain and then to a burning sun, they were decaying rapidly and could not be moved without breaking into pieces. They sent forth a sickening stench." And so this is the circumstance to which Mrs. McCormick returned after she'd heard that it was safe to go home. She sought out General Houston to register her complaint. She rode to the camp and told Houston that the sight would haunt her for the rest of her life. I'm sure it haunted a lot of people. Houston explained to her that he did not have enough men who were willing to guard the prisoners and also bury the dead in the state that they had reached. When addressed by Houston about it, Santa Anna refused to order his surviving men to bury their fallen comrades. Santa Anna suggested that the Texans just burn the dead. John J. Lynn, in his Reminiscences of 50 Years in Texas, reported that Mrs. McCormick was not pleased by what she found or impressed by General Houston's attempt to provide her with an appreciation of historic perspective. Lynn wrote that Houston attempted to calm her by saying, "Madam, your land will be famed in history as the classic spot on which the glorious Battle of San Jacinto was gained." And Peggy McCormick replied, and I wish I could do an Irish accent, but I can't, "To the devil with your glorious history. Take off your Mexicans." The Mexican prisoners would eventually leave. The dead were left in place. Spring turned to summer and the summer into fall, and the dead remained. Vultures and wolves would feast on the dead pack animals, it's said, but not on the dead soldiers. The American naturalist John James Audubon visited the battleground in 1837, and he made souvenirs of 5 Mexican soldiers' skulls and sent them to a friend in Philadelphia for examination. There are records that others also made souvenirs of the fallen Mexican skulls. Despite later appeals to the Texas government, nothing was done. William Zuber wrote, "When all their flesh had disappeared, the cattle of the locality chewed their bones, which imparted such a sickening odor and taste to the beef and milk that neither could be used. The citizens finally buried the bones, except for the skulls, which the cattle could not chew, to stop the ruin of the beef and milk." There had not been a noble interment for the burned dead of the Alamo or Goliad by the Mexicans, nor was there for the Mexican dead, sons, brothers, uncles, fathers. Such can be the way of the warrior, voluntary and involuntary. Again, Homer's lines are appropriate. It is only what happens when they die to all mortals. The sinews no longer hold the flesh and the bones together. And once the spirit has let the white bones, all the rest of the body is made subject to the fire's strong fury, but the soul flitters out like a dream and flies away. I've heard it said that on April 21st, the Texians won an important battle. But the capture of Santa Ana on the 22nd pretty much won the war. And it would take many risings and settings of the sun to make it sure that that was what happened. It was not an immediate understanding that the conflict would not continue in the following weeks and months. That is what happened. But there was a threat not long after that the Mexican army might just return. But we'll get into that later. So to close, consider one more line by Houston's beloved Homer. This from the Odyssey, not the Iliad. And the poet wrote, "That is the God's work, spinning threads of death through the lives of mortal men, and all to make a song for those to come." Texians and the volunteers from America and Europe had won the battle through determination, rage, and a big dollop of luck. But at the moment that the sun set on April 21st, 1836, no person could be 100% certain that the war had truly been won. Many had thought that the war had been won when Ben Milam led the Texians into San Antonio at the end of 1835. There were still thousands of members of the Mexican army not far away at the end of April. But that capture of Santa Ana the day after the battle would definitely help provide a little bit more confidence, some peace of mind. The violence and bloodshed on that day, April 21st, 1836, the cries of victory and of anguish, the blows of gun stocks against skulls, the cuts of bowie knives and bayonets, the powerful explosions of black powder, and the reverberating blasts of the Twin Sisters contributed to the many early chords that began the song of the Texas myth and mystique that we still hear the echoes of. And one of the earliest examples, and in the coming episodes, I'm going to be taking a look at how the events we've been looking at have been used progressing forward to the present day and remembered to shape this myth and mystique of Texas. And Mirabeau Lamar, who showed gallantry and got recognition on the 20th of April for his actions on the field, he was a poet. And in Philip Graham's Life and Poems of Lamar, shares an incident about Lamar's participation in the battle and something leading up to it. The night before the Battle of San Jacinto, one of the men that died in the battle was named Benjamin Rice Brigham. And for a long time in the late 19th century, the only monument there was the Brigham Monument before the modern day Great San Jacinto Monument was built in the early 1900s. But according to Graham in his biography of Lamar, the night before the Battle of San Jacinto, Brigham rushed into the tent of his friends, looking for somebody to substitute for his guard duty assignment. He said, according to Graham, "Boys, I've stood guard 2 nights and I am detailed for the 3rd. I want to be in the battle tomorrow. Will somebody take my place tonight?" And a gentleman named F.J. Cook, who was a comrade in arms, volunteered, and Brigham went to sleep so he would be fresh for the next day's battle. And he was among the first to fall, and he died a few hours later. Not instantly killed in the battle, but he did die a few hours later. Lamar, according to Graham, was deeply moved at the sight of his body, and after retiring to his tent, he wrote one of the first memorials and songs to the Texas myth and mystique and the glory of Texas, and a little poem called San Jacinto. And these are the words of the poem written on the field of San Jacinto. So this is San Jacinto by Maribel Lamar. "Beautiful in death, the soldier's corpse appears, embalmed by fond affection's breath, and bathed in his country's tears. Lo, the battle forms its terrible array, like clashing clouds in mountain storms that thunder on their way. The rushing armies meet, and while they pour their breath, the strong earth trembles at their feet, and day grows dim with death. Now launch upon the foe the lightnings of your rage. Strike the assailing tyrants low, the monsters of the age. They yield, they break, they fly, the victory is won. Pursue, they faint, they fall, they die. Oh, stay, the work is done. Mourn the death of those who for their country die. Sink on her bosom for repose, and triumph where they lie. Laurels for those who bled, the living heroes do. But holier wreaths will crown the dead, a grateful nation's love." And that is one of the very first poetic efforts to memorialize the events of San Jacinto. And you can see in it, he does capture the elements of what the battle were with some very poetic form. But the aspect of death did strike him, and he conveyed that with his words. Now, in a communication with General Urrea a couple of days after Santa Anna's defeat, Ramirez y Sesma, who had been part of the campaign but was not present at the battle, added an interesting note. He wrote, "It was useless to lecture or to plead, and at last what he was constantly warned against has happened. It is regrettable, but there is nothing to do now except guard the interests of the nation and those who remain." That's another early statement against Santa Anna and his decision-making process that led him there. And so, as I've said, at least for the moment, the Texians had cause to celebrate. Mexico, despite any assurances Santa Anna gave in the treaties of Velasco, was not prepared to recognize Texas's independence and the loss of its territory. Santa Anna's power, despite what Houston and others said, it was not absolute power. He would come back to power, but others held control of the country when he was captured. And the chain of events that the victory and death at San Jacinto began would unleash a torrent of blood for the god of death in decades to come. Santa Anna would sign the 2 treaties of Velasco, make a long return trip that involved going to Washington, D.C., and eventually he would return to power in Mexico and become president many more times. Sam Houston, leaning heavily on the victory at San Jacinto, would be elected the first president of Texas, then its first governor when it finally entered the Union. He'd serve as senator of the United States Senate and again be governor when Texas decided to depart despite his protests, as the United States entered another period of bloodshed, fire, and turmoil that was a civil war. And later in the year, in August 1836, just up the stream of Buffalo Bayou, not far from where the battle took place, some entrepreneurs would establish the foundation for a city that would bear Houston's name in his lifetime. Today, it is the most diverse metropolitan area in the United States and the most populated city in Texas and the South and the fifth most populated city in the United States. Now, an interesting coincidence of history is that April 21st, 1836 was the 20th birthday of a man named Lawrence Wigfall. Maybe you've heard of him. I assume many of you have not, but in the 1850s, he was quite a big deal. Like many, he would make his way to Texas eventually and become a Texan, and he would be a huge political enemy to Sam Houston. And through his powerful oratory, he would become one of the leading fire eaters who were so instrumental in the secession movement. And Wigfall, of course, made sure that he was present to be at Fort Sumter when it surrendered. Now, the stories of this war and all wars are still relevant today. Homer scholar Bernard Knox wrote, 3,000 years have not changed the human condition in this respect. We are still lovers and victims of the will to violence. And while it may seem sad to hear that, I think it is pretty accurate. Yet we can be calmed by the thought that just as much as violence is part of human nature as depicted by Homer, so is love an integral part of our being. In 2012, Carnegie Council President Joel Rosenthal at the annual Maine Humanities Council Winter Weekend Seminar at Bowdoin College said, Friedrich Nietzsche cited human nature as a source of this acceptance. There was, Nietzsche said, a will to power that is inescapable. Ancient and modern political philosophers express this idea in different ways. Thucydides observed that men resort to war for three reasons: interests, meaning material benefit, fear, and honor. Thomas Hobbes observed that in the state of nature, meaning in the natural world, there is no controlling authority. According to Hobbes, we live in an anarchic and unstable world where in pre-modern times life was solitary, nasty, brutish, and short. Contemporary realists take this idea to mean that we live in a world of competition and constant threats that create a structural security dilemma, end quote. Now, the cause of the Texas War for Independence might very well be summed up by what they said about Thucydides' observations. Many of them probably were fighting for their interest or material benefit. There were some present on the battlefield of the day they were fighting out of fear and the desire to survive. And there were some fighting, many fighting for an abstract thing these days, honor, and I would say ideals. There were people fighting for that. Not necessarily every participant fought for the same reasons. Some perhaps just fought to fight. Others, including many of the Mexican soldiers, fought because they were forced to fight. If that is true, as we constantly show that we are extremely capable of violence and war, it is imperative to remember that we're also often on a daily, minute by minute, second by second basis, we are able to have peace. We are able to love. But to return to the beginning of this very long episode, Judge Holden preached of violence in McCarthy's novel. But if you read his works closely, there can be found examples of love in his works because that is the nature of our existence and of our history. Extreme acts of love and kindness shadowed by and at times obliterated by extreme acts of violence. And while April 21st, the capture of Santa Anna after that and the treaties of Alaska might have marked the end of the Texas Revolution in our histories, there would be more hostility and warfare. Even as the players in the War of Texas Rebellion planned their next moves on the Texas coast, farther upstream up the rivers, little Cynthia Ann Parker and her family would soon be swept up when a Comanche band of warriors brought death and bloodshed to her home. Little Cynthia Ann would later give birth to one of the most famous Comanche warriors, Quanah Parker, who would be wrapped up in the war to preserve his people's freedom and way of life. In the Red River War, 40 years later, hostilities between the Texans and Mexico would continue until Texas became a member of the United States of the North. And the question of Texas independence would finally be laid to rest with the Mexican-American War. The gallant cavalry leader of San Jacinto, Lamar, would carry war to drive out the Cherokee and leave Houston's friend the Bull dead on the field of battle. Wigfall and the secessionist fire eaters would break Houston's beloved Union, and the resulting Civil War would send many Americans to violent ends, and the war for states' rights would become a war that would bring Jeff Parsons, who was enslaved and a member of the runaway scrape, and the other enslaved people of Texas, would bring them freedom. Afterwards, the victorious Union Army would carry on war to the peoples of the Great Plains. There would be more war. Spanish-American War, Pershing, Patton, and others would cross from Texas into Mexico to chase after Pancho Villa. Soldiers that were at the travesty of Wounded Knee in 1890 would lead doughboys under Pershing in the war to end all wars that Louis Jordan fought in, from the German Texan football star from University of Texas participated in and lost his life in that war. Patton, MacArthur, Texas native Nimitz, and Texas native Eisenhower, and many more would lead American soldiers in the next war that followed it, World War II. Then would come Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, and a number of conflicts that we have found ourselves in that aren't categorized as war, but the effects on the ground and the results of the conflict and fighting are the same. Many places around the world would be the places young Texans would fight with their American brothers in arms. Many would give their lives. And war might be hell, as Sherman said, but we are very adept at feeding its fire.
You are listening to Texas History Lessons, a slow walk through Texas history made in Texas by a Texan for everyone everywhere.
And in the end, I'm going to close this long. This is, as I've tried to make clear, this is my first rough draft dealing with some issues that are leading into some later episodes that are pretty involved. But I want to close this first attempt to make sense of these events, to present a vivid picture. No doubt there are errors in this work. More perspectives, especially by Mexican participants, would be beneficial to it. But as I said, this is the first draft working towards another larger goal in the end. And from across the decades, I am reminded by the voice of Dr. Cummins in a class on the Civil War, explaining that interest in battlefield movements and who stood where and who did what and who died in what circumstance. That's all well and good. But for the historian, many historians, it's even more interesting to consider why it happened and what were its results on the future. You know, we've got gas stations across the state that sell hats and t-shirts that declare Texas 1836. And an interesting thing I've noticed is that there are increasingly a number of the same type of paraphernalia that states Texas 1845, which I think is interesting because for most of my life, Texas 1836 has been the central thing. Now people are making, I guess it's what would you call it? Paraphernalia, pro-Texas gear was saying Texas 1845, but that's besides the point. That to me represents a hint that there is a shift in our popular memory, but neither of them is completely correct. Depending on your perspective, they are also not entirely wrong. Texas history did not begin in 1836 or 1845. The Tejanos that put their lives on the line in the rebellion were the soldiers on the field that day. They had the greatest claim on Texas history, having been born in Texas. And they had to fight with their commander just to be there. And that set the tone for the relationship between Anglo-Texans and Tejanos for the future. So in part, among many other things, I'm interested in the future looking at the transformation of real human beings like you and me. That's what they were. They were people put in situations where they made decisions and did things. And how did some of them make their way into the pantheon of Texas history, into being made? And I've seen this referred several times. Some of them have become immortals of Texas history. And what does that even mean? And that's something I'm very interested in. The 1836 is not the beginning of Texas history, but it is largely the beginning of the Texas myth and mystique, this image of Texas that I have talked about since the beginning of Lesson 0. And here's a little secret. This is still part of Lesson 0. I just figured, why keep putting it on? This is a way for me to try to get my thoughts together for the future of the podcast and decide how I want to continue on. And we'll start soon with an attempt to explore how Sam Houston and the Battle of San Jacinto were transformed from being a very real, very flawed person and a conflict at the Battle of San Jacinto, how those two things, a real person and a current event, turned into iconic symbols of Texas. And by tracing how it's been treated over time, it's a very interesting story. And that involves looking at art. That's the reason why I included the poem, because poetry and literature and the stories that we tell have shaped the way we look at Texas history and who we are as a people. And, I think that's a good spot for me to end. I'm not done with San Jacinto. There are so many stories that I have uncovered and I want to pursue in different threads that, that's interesting. There is a story about a man who was going to be at the Battle of San Jacinto, but he ended up catching the measles. His last name was Teal, and he was back at Harrisburg with sick and injured and others guarding the baggage when the battle happened. But he was a prominent captain in the army, but he just was not well enough to fight that day. He would participate in future of the Texas Army, which underwent some really interesting changes and hardships after the war was concluded. And there's an interesting connection between him and, if you've heard of the Natchez Trace, a gang of outlaws that Mark Twain said rivaled the exploits of Jesse James. And he ended up being murdered in encampment. But I'm getting ahead of myself. There are hundreds of stories like this I want to dig into and research. And I couldn't do that without a lot of the advantages we have today. The Portal of Texas History, the manuscripts that are made available by the Texas History Trust, all the different groups like the Sons of DeWitt County that make information available, and all the great historians that have put work out from everywhere, from articles to textbooks to just general books on subjects. They have made it possible for me to do this. And I have the list would be very long of people that I have gratitude towards for what they've helped us with. And, it's just an exciting time to be studying history. So with that, thanks for listening. If you're listening or watching this on YouTube, please subscribe. I'd appreciate it. And, if you're listening to it just as a normal podcast, thank you very much. Share it with friends. And, we got a lot of exciting stories about Texas history that we can cover. And, thanks for being along on the ride. And thanks to Derek McClendon for providing the theme music. We'll be back soon. Not sure exactly the timeline. I think pretty soon we'll be diving into the immortals of Texas, that looking at guys like Austin and how he early on was not considered as important during the mid 1800s as we consider him now. And how did that come about? How did that transformation come about to where he's recognized as essential? And I'm getting ahead of myself. And so thanks again. Take care of yourself. Take care of one another. Be kind. Adios.